Here's something the majority of people remain unaware of regarding the Bible. There exists a female warrior whose tactical brilliance in combat was so exceptional that military commanders continue studying it in our present day. Yet her narrative is absent from the majority of scriptural versions. The account of Judith appears within the deuterocanonical texts, and it's genuinely astonishing. Throughout this video, we're going to explore how this improbable champion employed psychological tactics in warfare, calculated seduction as strategy, and impeccable timing to overcome an empire that appeared invincible. We're going to examine her origins, her seemingly impossible assignment, and the unconventional approach she utilized to transform what seemed like unavoidable defeat into complete triumph. Before we get started though, if this is your first time here on this channel, think about hitting that like button and subscribing if you haven't done so yet. When you support us, it allows us to keep creating these thoroughly researched videos that help you discover something new or simply enjoy your time. Also, go ahead and let us know your location and what time it happens to be where you are. We'd really love to hear from you. So, with no more delays, let's get started, shall we? A nation facing danger. The Assyrian tempest. The world of antiquity understood what empires meant. Enormous kingdoms expanded across entire continents, devouring smaller nations the way waves devour grains of sand. However, very few empires generated the kind of terror that Assyria wielded. From their central territories in Mesopotamia, the Assyrians constructed an empire founded upon conquest combined with fear. Their military forces advanced like swarms of locusts throughout the terrain, leaving complete devastation behind them. The Book of Judith, located within the deuterocanonical writings, presents a narrative that merges historical recollection with theological intention. Scholars observe that the text includes intentional historical contradictions, likely written during the Hellenistic era between 150 and 100 BCE, yet positioned in an earlier time frame. The writer merges various figures and events together, producing what many scholars believe represents a piece of historical fiction crafted to inspire belief rather than document accurate history. In this particular telling, King Nebuchadnezzar reigns not from Babylon, as historical records indicate, but rather from Nineveh as monarch of the Assyrians. This specific detail signals to attentive readers that the narrative functions on a different level. The actual Nebuchadnezzar conquered Nineveh and obliterated the Assyrian Empire. However, within the Book of Judith, these historical strands interweave together into something different: a parable, a teaching, a narrative of impossible rescue. This version of Nebuchadnezzar has recently defeated a rival monarch, Arphaxad of Media, during a massive battle near Ecbatana. Victory makes him bold. He dispatches messengers across his extensive territories, summoning troops to accompany him during a westward military campaign. He insists upon submission from every nation, yet many decline. The western territories, including the mountainous region of Judea, reject his call. They refuse to bow down. They refuse to dispatch soldiers. They refuse to recognize his authority. The monarch's fury burns intensely at this act of defiance. He summons his advisory council, his nobility, his military leadership. Standing among them is Holofernes, his most reliable general. This man has become legendary for his military intelligence and his brutal methods. Nebuchadnezzar assigns him leadership of an enormous army with one straightforward command: force the West into submission or annihilate it completely. Display no compassion toward those who reject the summons. Holofernes gathers an army that staggers the mind. The Book of Judith documents numbers that scholars believe are symbolic instead of literal, intended to communicate overwhelming power. 120,000 foot soldiers, 12,000 mounted cavalry, supply convoys extending for miles, equipment for sieges, provisions designed for an extended campaign. This represents not simply an army. This represents the machinery of an empire, advancing to obliterate resistance wherever it emerges. The general initiates his westward march. One city after another collapses before him. Some capitulate right away, throwing open their gates, presenting tribute. Others mount resistance and face total destruction. Holofernes demonstrates no differentiation between those who surrender promptly and those who hesitate. All experience ravaging, all experience plundering, all discover what it means to fear the name of Nebuchadnezzar. The army traverses rivers and mountain ranges. It sweeps across territories that had experienced peace for multiple generations. The general's approach is systematic. He doesn't merely conquer, he obliterates. He sets fire to crops, demolishes temples, cuts down groves considered sacred. This represents not merely military conquest, this represents the erasure of identity, the crushing of spirit, the breaking of collective will. Reports of the Assyrian advance travel more rapidly than the army itself. People fleeing pour into the mountainous country of Judea, carrying accounts of horror. Entire urban centers reduced to cinders. Populations forced into slavery. Resistance answered, with atrocities designed to shatter the courage of those not yet conquered. The psychological warfare demonstrates effectiveness equal to the military strength. The inhabitants of Judea confront an impossible circumstance. Their territory sits squarely in the trajectory of this unstoppable force. The mountains that have sheltered them for generations now appear like simple obstacles meant to postpone the inevitable. The fortified urban centers that once appeared impenetrable now seem like temporary refuges before the approaching storm. The high priest Joachim, who governs from Jerusalem, dispatches urgent communications to every town and village. Strengthen your defensive positions. Protect the mountain passages. Do not capitulate. Most importantly, defend the holy city. Should Jerusalem collapse, everything collapses. The temple, the center of their faith and their identity, must not suffer defilement by foreign conquest. The people respond not with confidence, but rather with desperate resolve. They reinforce walls, they accumulate supplies, they make preparations for siege warfare. They remember the narratives of how their forebears survived impossible circumstances. They recall rescues from Egyptian bondage, from Philistine oppression, from innumerable enemies. Yet those memories seem distant at this moment, like tales from a different age when God intervened more visibly in human circumstances. Fear propagates through the mountain communities like frost in winter. Mothers observe their children and question whether they'll survive to witness another season. Fathers examine their weapons and recognize they're facing warriors who have conquered entire nations. The elderly recall previous wars and comprehend that what approaches is different, more thorough, more final. Holofernes receives intelligence regarding the terrain ahead. His reconnaissance forces return with reports of confined passages, fortified communities positioned on hilltops, inhabitants who understand every path and gorge throughout their homeland. The general remains unconcerned. He has defeated mountain populations before. He understands that courage holds no value against starvation, that faith disintegrates before thirst, that any fortress can be captured if you understand which resource to control. The Assyrian war apparatus grinds onward. The distance separating the army from Judea diminishes each day. In Jerusalem, priests conduct sacrifices and prayers. In the communities, families collect whatever food they're able. In the mountain passages, soldiers assume their positions and wait. The storm approaches. Everyone senses it. The question isn't whether it will strike. The question is whether anything will remain when it has passed. The geopolitical terrain of the ancient Near East generated the circumstances for this confrontation. Empires emerged from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, accumulating wealth through agricultural production and power through military structure. The mountainous country of Judea, in contrast, was lacking in resources but abundant in strategic importance. Control these mountains, and you control the passage between the great powers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Assyrians grasped this. So did the Judeans. This explains why the conflict was unavoidable. Holofernes examines maps and interrogates captives. He discovers information about the arrangement of Judean defenses. He identifies the critical positions that must collapse for the entire region to fall. And he perceives it, one community, Bethulia, a fortress city protecting the primary pass into the heartland. Capture Bethulia, and the route to Jerusalem becomes accessible. The general smiles. He has located his objective. The siege of Bethulia, the stranglehold on Israel. The community of Bethulia sits like a crown, positioned atop a mountain, protecting the southern approach toward the valley of Jezreel. Scholars argue about its precise historical location, with some proposing it represents a combination of several Judean fortress communities rather than a single identifiable location. The name itself might originate from Hebrew roots, signifying virgin or house of God, indicating its symbolic significance in the narrative. Geography provides Bethulia its strength. The community commands the elevated ground above a confined pass. Any army seeking to advance through this passage must either capture the community or risk a perilous detour through even more hazardous terrain. The founders selected this location with intention. Natural springs supply water, rocky inclines make frontal assault expensive. Stone barriers constructed upon the mountain's foundation create a formidable obstacle. Holofernes arrives with his extensive army and analyzes the circumstances. He encircles the base of the mountain, eliminating all escape routes. His soldiers disperse throughout the valley below, their innumerable tents forming a city of their own. Smoke from their fires saturates the air. The noise of their movements, the collision of weapons during training exercises, the voices of thousands of men, all generate a continuous reminder of the force waiting below. The general doesn't command an immediate assault. He has gained knowledge from earlier sieges. Mountain fortresses require patience. The defenders possess height advantage. They can rain arrows and stones down upon anyone trying to ascend the steep approaches. A frontal attack would eventually succeed, but the expense in Assyrian casualties would be considerable. Holofernes favors efficiency over recognition. He desires victory without needless casualties, so he examines the community more thoroughly. He dispatches scouts to monitor. He questions local inhabitants who understand the region, and he uncovers Bethulia's vulnerability. The community has wells within its barriers, certainly, but not sufficient for an extended siege. The primary water supply originates from springs beyond the walls, down the mountain inclines. Springs that his army now dominates. The general delivers his commands. Capture every water source. Station guards at every spring and stream. Permit no one from the community to access water. The Assyrians carry out this strategy with ruthless accuracy. They locate every spring within range of the community. They position armed patrols at each site. They construct small fortifications at the principal water sources. The noose constricts, not around throats, but around the very source of life itself. Within Bethulia, the inhabitants initially maintain confidence. They possess supplies, they possess wells, they possess faith that God will rescue them as he rescued their ancestors. The men maintain watch on the barriers, the women prepare meals, the children play in the streets, not yet comprehending the danger. Life proceeds with a forced appearance of normality. However, days elapse, the wells within the community begin to diminish. The meticulous rationing commences. Each family obtains a measured portion of water, sufficient to survive, but insufficient to genuinely satisfy thirst. The reality settles, gradually like dust in motionless air. The Assyrians aren't going to launch an attack. They're going to wait. They're going to allow thirst to accomplish their work for them. The heat of summer presses down on the mountain. Within the barriers, cisterns that once appeared full now reveal their bottoms. Perhaps enslavement under the Assyrians would be preferable to witnessing their children perish from thirst. The community leaders preserve what order they can. They continue distributing what water remains as equitably as possible. They urge the inhabitants to stay strong. They remind everyone of God's previous deliverances. They arrange prayer assemblies. They attempt to maintain hope alive. But even they can perceive the conclusion approaching. Even they experience the weakness in their own bodies. Even they start to question how much longer faith can sustain flesh that lacks water. Holofernes observes from below with contentment. He has defeated this fortress without losing a single man. He has shattered their will without a battle. Soon they will plead to surrender. Soon they will throw open their gates and prostrate themselves before Assyrian power. And then the route to Jerusalem will become accessible. The campaign will advance. The empire will expand. And one more population will discover that resistance against Assyria is pointless. The general remains unaware that his flawless siege contains a weakness, not in his military approach, not in his domination of water, but in his presumption that the inhabitants of Bethulia possess no other resource to access. He has calculated accurately regarding their physical constraints. He has accounted for human frailty, but he hasn't accounted for what faith can generate when all human alternatives have been depleted. He hasn't considered that rescue might arrive from the most unexpected source. He hasn't conceived that a single widow praying in her chamber might reverse everything his extensive army has achieved. But that narrative is still developing. For the present moment, Bethulia perishes gradually, and the Assyrian general waits with the patience of a predator that understands its prey cannot flee. The peoples lament, a crisis of belief. The 34th day of siege arrives over Bethulia with pitiless heat. No clouds soften the sun's assault, no breeze delivers relief. Within the barriers, the community has transformed into a location of death. Not the sudden death of combat, but the slow, torturous death of dehydration. Bodies rest in the streets where individuals collapsed. The living lack the strength to relocate them. Tongues have expanded in mouths, rendering speech challenging. Lips fracture and bleed. Eyes recede into skulls. Skin assumes a grey pallor. Children no longer weep because their bodies cannot manufacture tears. The silence that descends over Bethulia is more dreadful than any sound of combat. This is the silence of the dying. In desperate households, mothers hold infants who no longer stir. The infants' eyes gaze without perceiving. Their tiny chests scarcely rise and fall. The mothers themselves are too weak to cry, too dehydrated to manufacture tears. Even if emotion could affect them, they simply hold their children and wait for whatever arrives next. The elderly succumb first. Their bodies, already worn by time, cannot withstand the deprivation. They pass quietly, frequently in their sleep, transitioning from one form of unconsciousness to another more permanent form. Families lack the energy even to properly grieve. The deceased receive cursory treatment because the living must preserve every fragment of strength. Young men who once stood proud on the barriers now slump against stones. Their weapons rest forgotten beside them. The watchmen scarcely watch any longer. What significance does it hold? The Assyrians display no indication of attacking. They simply wait below, comfortable in their encampments, understanding that time fights their battle for them. The market square, once vibrant with commerce and dialogue, now hosts assemblies of a different nature. Individuals congregate not to purchase and sell, but to share their misery, to express complaints, to challenge leadership, to wonder aloud why this suffering persists. The atmosphere grows dangerous. Desperation cultivates anger. Anger seeks targets. Someone commences speaking, a man whose name the text doesn't document. Perhaps his identity holds less importance than what he represents, the voice of human breaking point. He addresses the crowd assembling around him. His words are straightforward, unambiguous. Why are we doing this? Why are we selecting death by thirst when we could capitulate and at least rescue our children? Others participate. The voices multiply. A woman speaks of her daughter who perished the previous night, her small body finally surrendering its struggle. A father describes the torment of witnessing his son plead for water that doesn't exist. An elderly man challenges whether their leaders possess any strategy beyond waiting for everyone to die. The anger builds. The crowd expands. The words become more cutting. They march to the residence of Uzziah, the community's chief magistrate. The crowd occupies the street beyond his door. They pound on his gate. They insist he confront them. They will no longer be placated with platitudes regarding faith and rescue. They want responses. They want action. They want relief from this suffering. Uzziah emerges with his fellow leaders, Shabris and Sharmis. The text identifies these men, providing them identity, perhaps to emphasize their responsibility in this moment. They stand before an angry, dying population. The magistrate lifts his hand for silence. The crowd quiets, but the anger persists, visible in their sunken eyes and tense postures. Before Uzziah can speak, the accusations commence. One person shouts that the leaders have guided them to destruction. Another proclaims that surrender to Assyria would have been superior to this gradual death. A woman's voice rises above the others, raw with grief and fury. She demands to understand whether the leaders' pride is worth the lives of their children. The crowd adopts this theme. Better to exist as slaves than perish of thirst. Better to bow to Nebuchadnezzar than to witness infants die in their mother's arms. Better to forfeit freedom than to forfeit everything. The logic of desperation is challenging to oppose. The argument appears reasonable. Survival is superior to death. Slavery is superior to extinction. Someone articulates what many are considering. Summon Holofernes. Negotiate capitulation. Allow the Assyrians to enter the community. Accept whatever terms they present. Slavery might be harsh, but at least slaves obtain water. At least slaves can maintain their children alive. At least slaves can continue existing. Death terminates everything. The crowd presses nearer. The anger verges toward violence. These aren't rebels or agitators. These are ordinary inhabitants pushed beyond endurance. These are parents witnessing their children die. These are human beings whose bodies are failing. The social agreement that binds communities together frays when fundamental needs go unmet for too long. Uzziah perceives the danger. He comprehends that if he refuses completely, the crowd might riot. They might assault his house. They might take matters into their own hands and throw open the gates, regardless of official authorization. He must provide them something. He must offer hope, or at least the promise of a conclusion to their suffering. But Uzziah also experiences the weight of responsibility beyond the immediate crisis. He understands the narratives of his people's history. He understands how God has rescued them previously, frequently at the final moment. He understands that surrender to Assyria signifies more than slavery. It signifies the conclusion of their identity as a distinct population. It signifies the desecration of their faith. It signifies the triumph of foreign deities over the God of their ancestors. The magistrate confronts an impossible selection: refuse the crowd and risk immediate violence and the collapse of all order, accept their demand and betray everything his people claim to believe, select death by principle or survival by submission. Leaders throughout history have confronted such moments. Most select survival. Principles are luxuries that dying individuals cannot afford. Uzziah speaks. His voice is weak from thirst, but carries authority nonetheless. He doesn't reject their plea completely. He doesn't offer empty assurances that assistance is arriving. Instead, he proposes a compromise, a delay, a test of divine intervention. The magistrate's words shape the next phase of the crisis. He informs the crowd that he comprehends their suffering. He shares it. He too is dying of thirst. He too has family at risk. He isn't immune to the agony that grips the community. But he requests 5 more days. 5 days to determine if God will act, 5 days to provide deliverance, an opportunity. If following 5 days no assistance has arrived, if no rain descends, if no relief materializes, then they will capitulate. Uzziah makes this promise publicly, binding himself and his fellow leaders to this timeline. 5 days, 120 hours. And then, if nothing transforms, they will throw open the gates to the Assyrians. They will accept whatever fate awaits them, but they will at least still be alive. The crowd considers this. 5 days appears both impossibly extended and mercifully brief. Extended for those suffering, brief for those hoping for miracles. The inhabitants are too weak to argue further. The promise of a conclusion point, even one 5 days distant, provides something to grasp, a deadline, a moment when the agony will terminate one way or another. The crowd disperses gradually. Individuals return to their residences to wait, to suffer through 5 more days, to determine whether the God their ancestors worshipped will remember his people, to discover whether faith possesses any substance beyond words. The test is established. The timer is operating. And in her residence across the community, a widow named Judith hears about this promise and commences forming a strategy that no one could possibly anticipate. Uzziah's dilemma, the leader's burden. The crowd has departed. The street beyond Uzziah's residence empties as individuals drag themselves back to their homes to endure 5 more days of torment. The magistrate stands in his doorway with Shabri and Shamis beside him. The 3 men say nothing for an extended moment. They have just made a promise that may condemn their entire people, or perhaps they have already failed their people by resisting this long. Uzziah enters his residence and closes the door. The weight of leadership has never felt more crushing. The selection he just made satisfies no one, least of all himself. 5 days. The number emerged from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, extended enough to provide God space to act, brief enough to prevent immediate riot. But the question gnaws at him. Did he just put God to the test? Did he just place conditions on divine compassion? The magistrate isn't young. He has led Bethulia for years. He has resolved disputes, organized defenses, managed resources, made innumerable small decisions that keep a community operating. But those were ordinary problems with human solutions. This crisis surpasses anything in his experience. How does one lead when every option leads to disaster? How does one select between physical death and spiritual death? Shabris and Shamis share his burden. The text identifies these two as Bethulia's other leading men, suggesting a council structure rather than sole authority. They stand together in Uzziah's residence. 3 men attempting to navigate impossible waters. They possess families too. They suffer thirst too. They confront the same selection every individual in the community faces, with the added weight of responsibility for everyone else's selections. The tradition they inherited speaks unambiguously about trusting God. The narratives Uzziah learned as a child tell of deliverance after deliverance, the exodus from servitude in the land of pyramids, the crossing of waters that separated, the conquest of fortified cities by miraculous means, the judges who emerged to rescue their people, the prophets who spoke God's word in dark times. The pattern is unmistakable. God rescues, God delivers, God doesn't abandon his people. But those are ancient narratives, tales from a different era. The inhabitants of Bethulia understand the narratives, but they also understand their present reality. They understand the sensation of a throat constricting from thirst. They understand the sight of children dying. They understand the weakness that makes each step an effort. Narratives don't quench thirst. Faith doesn't fill cisterns. Belief doesn't bring water from rocks, regardless of what occurred in the ancient wilderness. Uzziah confronts the question that every person of faith eventually encounters. When do you cease waiting for divine intervention and take human action? When does faith become fatalism? When does trust become foolishness? The line isn't clear. The decision isn't obvious. Good individuals can disagree about when to act and when to wait. The magistrate considers the promise he just made, 5 days. In those 5 days, what could possibly occur? Will rain suddenly descend from a cloudless sky? Will a river burst from the rock? Will an army arrive to shatter the siege? The practical part of his mind perceives no realistic hope. The Assyrians control everything. No assistance is arriving. No miracle appears imminent. 5 days will elapse, and nothing will transform, except that more individuals will die. Yet something in Uzziah resists this logic. Call it faith, call it stubbornness. Call it the deep cultural memory of a population who survived against odds previously. He cannot quite bring himself to believe that this is the conclusion, that this is how the narrative of his people concludes. Dying of thirst in a forgotten mountain community while a pagan army waits below. Surely this cannot be the final chapter. But what if it is? What if God has indeed abandoned them? What if the prophets were mistaken? Or what if the conditions for deliverance no longer exist? What if faith is just a narrative individuals tell themselves to make sense of a random, uncaring world? These thoughts are dangerous, heretical, but in the privacy of his mind, Uzziah cannot fully suppress them. The weight of the 5-day promise crushes him. He has essentially informed God when to act. He has established a deadline for the Almighty. The arrogance of it horrifies him now that the crowd has departed and he can think clearly. Who is he to inform the Creator of all things when deliverance must arrive? Who is he to test God's timing? Yet what else could he have done? Inform the inhabitants? No. Witness them riot and tear the community apart. Throw open the gates immediately and hand everyone over to Assyrian compassion, which is no compassion at all. Every option appears wrong. Every path leads to destruction. Leadership in crisis signifies selecting between terrible options and living with the consequences. Chabris speaks for the first time since they entered the residence. He asks the question they're all considering. What occurs in 5 days when nothing has transformed? When they must fulfill their promise and capitulate, what will the Assyrians do to them? The historical record of Assyrian conquest provides no comfort. They don't simply accept submission. They extract revenge for resistance. They make examples. They ensure that others think carefully before defying them. The community will be plundered. That much is certain. The Assyrians will claim anything of value. They will strip Bethulia of its wealth, such as it is. A mountain community holds little treasure compared to great cities, but even small amounts accumulate across multiple conquests. The soldiers will claim their prizes. The inhabitants will be enslaved. That too is inevitable. Some will be marched to Nineveh to serve in the capital. Others will be scattered throughout the empire, separated from their families, forbidden to maintain their cultural identity. The Assyrians have perfected this tactic. Disperse conquered peoples, mix populations, break the bonds that hold communities together. In a generation or two, the distinct identity of Bethulia will fade. Its inhabitants will become just more subjects of the empire. The community itself will likely be destroyed. The Assyrians might leave the barriers standing as a warning, but they will burn the residences. They will desecrate the places of worship. They will ensure that Bethulia serves as a lesson to any other community considering resistance. This is what occurs when you defy Nebuchadnezzar. This is the cost of defiance. And Jerusalem. What occurs to the holy city when the path lies accessible? Holofernes will march onward, the heartland will be exposed, the temple will be threatened. Everything the inhabitants of Judea hold sacred will be at risk. Bethulia's surrender might rescue its inhabitants temporarily, but it condemns countless others. Yet how can Uzziah ask his people to die for the sake of others who cannot assist them? The magistrate paces his small residence. His feet shuffle rather than stride because thirst has weakened him like everyone else. He isn't some heroic figure immune to suffering. He is just a man attempting to do right in a circumstance where right isn't clear. He is a leader who never sought war, but must navigate its consequences. He is human, which signifies he experiences fear and doubt and the desperate hope that something might transform. Sharmis raises another possibility. What if assistance does arrive? What if someone locates a way to shatter the siege? What if rain does descend? What if God does act? The 5 days could be sufficient time for something unexpected to occur. The world contains more possibilities than their limited vision can perceive. Stranger things have occurred. The histories document unlikely victories and impossible rescues. Uzziah desires to believe this. He clings to it. But belief feels like grasping at smoke, intangible, insubstantial, easy to name but impossible to hold. Still, it is all he possesses. 5 days, 120 hours. Sufficient time for a miracle. Sufficient time for everything to transform. Or sufficient time for a few dozen more individuals to die before the inevitable surrender. The 3 men pray together. They recite the ancient words their ancestors spoke in times of trouble. They call upon God to remember his covenant. They request deliverance. They confess their inadequacy for this moment. They lay their burden before the divine and request wisdom for strength, for some indication that they haven't been abandoned. The prayers bring some comfort, but no responses. The ceiling doesn't open. No voice speaks from the air. No angel appears with instructions. Just 3 frightened men in a dying community, holding on to hope by their fingernails, waiting to determine whether faith has substance or whether it is just another word for the refusal to accept reality. Uzziah dismisses his companions. They need rest. They need what little water their rations permit. They need to return to their own families and confront their own struggles. The meeting concludes. The burden persists. 5 days. The countdown has commenced, and somewhere in Bethulia, a widow named Judith sits in her upper room, hearing reports of what the leaders promised, and commences perceiving a path that no one else has considered. The whisper of a widow, introducing Judith. While Bethulia's leaders agonize over impossible selections and the inhabitants endure their slow death by thirst, one household remains strangely removed from the public despair. Not distant in geography, the residence sits within the community, barriers like all others, but distant in spirit, separate in focus, different in the rhythm of its daily existence. This is the residence of Judith. The book of Judith introduces her with careful attention to lineage. She is the daughter of Merari, son of Ox, son of Joseph, descending through a line that traces back through the tribe of Simeon. The text provides this genealogy with deliberate precision, establishing her credentials within the community. She isn't an outsider, not a foreign woman who married in, not someone of questionable background. She is thoroughly of her people, with roots deep in their history. Her late husband was Manasseh. The text speaks of him in past tense because he died 3 years before the siege commenced. His death arrived during the barley harvest, a detail that suggests his prosperity. He possessed fields extensive enough to require harvest labor. He possessed wealth, property, status. When he died, these things passed to Judith, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in Bethulia. Manasseh's death itself carries significance. He was working in the fields during the harvest when the sun's heat struck him down. The text suggests heat stroke, a common enough danger for agricultural workers in the region's brutal summers. He collapsed among the barley he was supervising. They carried him to his residence, but he never recovered. He died in his own bed, with Judith beside him. 3 years have elapsed since that loss. 3 years during which Judith has existed as a widow, maintaining her household, managing her late husband's estates, declining all suggestions that she remarry. Wealthy widows attract attention. Men in the community have certainly noticed her continued availability. Offers have been made, proposals have been suggested, all have been refused. Judith's daily existence follows patterns established during her mourning and never abandoned. She occupies an upper room in her residence, a private space set apart from the normal flow of domestic activity. This chamber serves as her sanctuary, her place of prayer and reflection. She spends much of her time there, engaging in practices that mark her as unusually devout, even in a religious community. She fasts regularly, not the occasional fasting that most individuals practice on holy days, but an aggressive schedule that would weaken most people. She fasts every day except the Sabbath, the eve of Sabbath, new moons, and major festivals. This signifies she consumes regular meals only on a minority of days. The discipline is extreme, the dedication remarkable. When she does eat, her meals are simple. No luxurious foods despite her wealth. No elaborate preparations despite having servants to cook for her. She maintains the diet of someone in perpetual mourning, as though her grief for Manasseh continues undimmed. Human, please continue from where you stopped. Deliverance will arrive before the 5-day period expires. Her tone carries a certainty that leaves no space for questioning. Shabaz regains his ability to speak. He poses the natural question, how could they possibly allow her to leave the city unhindered? How could they permit a woman of standing to venture into harm's way based on a strategy she refuses to explain? What happens if the enemy captures her? What if the Assyrian forces inflict harm upon her? The burden of responsibility presses down on them. Judith frees them from that burden. She clarifies that this represents her own choosing, her own resolution, her own initiative. They are not dispatching her anywhere. They are merely refraining from blocking her departure. The difference holds significance. Those in leadership positions must sometimes permit others to take action instead of controlling every decision themselves. Shamaz presents a separate worry. He questions whether her strategy involves offering herself as a sacrifice to save the city, whether she plans some form of self-sacrifice. The notion that she might exchange herself for the survival of the community both appalls and entices them. Judith informs them that her approach does not rely on any such straightforward trade. What lies ahead for her is something altogether different, something unforeseen, something requiring confidentiality to work. She requests only that they intercede through prayer on her behalf, that they keep the entrance ready for opening upon her return, that they place their confidence in God to operate through methods beyond their ability to predict. The three men exchange looks with one another. No superior alternative exists for them. Their own strategy concludes only in capitulation. Judith presents a different path, however unclear it may be. What stands to be lost? Should she not succeed, their position remains unchanged from its current state. Should she achieve success, everything transforms. The reasoning is straightforward. Uzziah provides his approval. He will direct the sentries to permit Judith and her servant to exit through the gates. He will refrain from inquiring about her intentions. He will simply remain and offer prayers. The remaining leaders voice their agreement. They have just transferred their responsibility onto the shoulders of a woman who lost her husband, and uncertainty fills them about whether relief or shame is the appropriate response. Judith makes ready to depart, but prior to leaving, she delivers one last instruction. She tells them to maintain their responsibilities as community leaders. Preserve whatever order remains possible. Keep the population as settled as circumstances allow. Do not permit disorder to consume the town. She will come back, she gives her word. And upon her return, everyone will recognize that the God of their forefathers continues to intervene on behalf of his chosen people. The leaders take their leave. They go back to their residences, their thoughts crowded with uncertainties. What could she be planning? How might a single woman alter anything? Yet they have consented to her appeal. They have granted her liberty to proceed. And given the dire circumstances confronting them, even an improbable hope surpasses having no hope whatsoever. Within her upper chamber, Judith commences the concluding preparations. The woman who lost her husband and has remained in isolation is preparing to emerge. The woman who has dressed in garments of grief for 3 full years is preparing to undergo transformation. The faithful woman of prayer is preparing to become something nobody anticipated. The following stage of her strategy demands not merely faith, but also careful planning. Not merely bravery, but also precision. Not merely hope, but also decisive steps. And she stands ready. The strategy takes shape, a prayer requesting blessing upon deception. Nighttime descends upon Bethulia. The settlement rests in silence apart from sporadic sounds of distress. In one location, a young child weeps faintly. In another place, someone coughs, their throat too parched to clear itself effectively. The sentries positioned on the walls move with deliberate slowness, preserving their remaining energy. The campfires of the Assyrian forces below form a circle of illumination surrounding the darkened mountainside. The difference is unmistakable. Vitality and abundance below, mortality and scarcity above. In her elevated room, Judith kneels down. She has sent her servant away for the time being. What follows next demands solitude. She must voice words that no other person should hear ahead of their appointed time. She must present her strategy before God and request favor upon actions that will disturb the moral conscience. The chamber is unadorned despite her material prosperity. No ornate furnishings exist, no decorative elements, merely a space devoted to prayer. A location she has inhabited innumerable times across 3 years. A room that has received her sorrow, her supplications, her worship. This evening, it will receive something altogether different. This evening, she will pray for the accomplishment of deceit. Judith lowers herself completely, face pressed to the floor, arms stretched outward, assuming the position of absolute submission. She does not open with petitions. She opens with remembering. She recounts the historical narratives of her people. She recalls previous occasions when God accomplished his purposes through unexpected instruments, through afflictions and separations, through leaders and spokespersons, through the powerless overcoming the powerful. She speaks of Simeon, her forefather through numerous generations. She recalls the account of Dinah and the inhabitants of Shechem, the violation that occurred, the vengeance that followed, the bloodshed that came after trickery. She does not shrink from the harsh reality of that ancient narrative. She identifies it directly. She acknowledges its existence, and she proposes that what transpired in that time might reflect what must transpire now. A commander who believes he will possess a woman, a leader eliminated through his own appetite. This represents a troubling prayer. Judith is not requesting heavenly armies. She is not asking for a wonder like water flowing from stone. She is requesting that God favor a strategy constructed upon falsehoods and enticement, to employ her physical appearance as an instrument to permit deception in the service of rescue. The ethical complexity cannot be denied. She recognizes it fully. She names it within her prayer. She speaks of the Assyrians. She will enter the hostile encampment, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of soldiers. She will stand alone apart from her servant. She will possess no protection beyond her intelligence and God's blessing. Innumerable things might go wrong. A warrior who disregards commands. A sentry who perceives through her fabrication. An instant when the general's desire converts to fury. She comprehends the perils. She requests protection not away from danger, but surrounded by danger. Judith's prayer demonstrates her comprehension of how God operates. She does not anticipate divine action that circumvents human participation. She anticipates divine strengthening of human participation. God will not eliminate Holofernes through lightning strikes. God will fortify Judith's arm to eliminate him herself. God will not perplex the Assyrian military through supernatural methods. God will utilize their organic confusion upon discovering their commander deceased. The collaboration between divine and human represents the pathway to deliverance. She prays for the particular result she requires, that the Assyrians will accept her narrative as truth, that Holofernes will be misled by her outward appearance, that she will obtain access to him in private, that the opportunity will present itself when he is unguarded, that she will possess the bravery to take action when that opportunity materializes. Each component of her strategy relies upon circumstances aligning favorably. Each phase demands things to proceed correctly. She prays for that alignment. The prayer continues for many hours. Judith does not hurry. She does not present a brief petition and continue onward. She empties her heart completely. She contends with the morality of what she intends. She pursues confirmation that she is not operating from arrogance or presumption. She presents herself as an instrument and requests that God guide that instrument toward the correct target in the correct manner at the correct moment. While she prays, something changes within her. The fear does not vanish completely, but it withdraws. The uncertainty does not disappear, but it becomes quieter. A perception of clarity comes forth. A certainty that this represents the path, that what she plans is not merely her own conception, but something for which she has been prepared, that all the years of self-discipline and dedication have culminated in this moment, that her state as a widow was not merely loss, but preparation. She thinks of Manasseh. Her departed husband never realized that his wife would become this. He married a woman from a respectable family. He obtained an honored companion. He experienced a normal existence of wealth and tranquility. He could not have envisioned that 3 years following his death, his widow would kneel in their upper chamber, praying for success in a strategy to eliminate an enemy commander. Existence takes unanticipated turns. Individuals become what circumstances require. Judith rises from prayer. Her choice is settled. Her determination is solid. She has positioned the result in God's control. Yet she has also prepared herself to serve as God's hands. The collaboration is finalized. The strategy is established. Tomorrow she will transform from widow into weapon. This evening, she rests as much as deprivation and strain permit. Her final night is simply Judith, the faithful widow. Her final night prior to becoming Judith, the rescuer. Her final night of the former existence before the new existence commences. In the darkness, she reclines. Sleep arrives gradually. Her thoughts cycle through the particulars of her strategy, the account she will present, the manner in which she will dress herself, the behavior she will display. Everything must achieve perfection. A single error could terminate not merely her existence, but any possibility of rescue for her community. The burden is tremendous, but she has supported burden previously. Sorrow is weighty. Loss is weighty. 3 years of mourning are weighty. This is simply a different variety of burden, and she possesses sufficient strength to support it. Beyond her window, the Assyrian fires continue burning throughout the night. Thousands of soldiers rest in those encampments. They envision conquest and spoils. They anticipate the capitulation that must arrive shortly. They possess no awareness that their own elimination is being arranged in a widow's chamber. They cannot conceive that their powerful general will be brought down by a woman's appearance and blade. They rest confident in their might. That confidence represents their weakness, and Judith is preparing to take advantage of it thoroughly. The transformation from one who grieves to one who entices. The woman who exits the city entrance must appear entirely different from the woman her community members recognize. The widow in mourning garments must vanish. In her position must emerge a woman of remarkable beauty and refinement. The transformation must be thorough, persuasive, undeniable. Judith summons her servant. The devoted attendant has remained with her throughout the years of widowhood. She has honored her mistress's decisions. She has never challenged the severe lifestyle. She has supported the fasting and prayer. Yet now she will observe something completely unexpected, and she will be requested to take part in it. Judith speaks to her servant, though not with complete detail. She discloses that they will exit the city this evening, that they will proceed to the Assyrian encampment, that Judith possesses a strategy to bring rescue. The servant's eyes grow wide, but she raises no objection. Years of service have established confidence. If Judith states this is required, then it is required. If Judith states this represents God's plan, then who is she to raise questions? The transformation commences with water, valuable water that most of Bethulia does not possess. Yet Judith maintains reserves, and she employs them now for bathing. She removes 3 years of widow's dust. She purifies herself according to ritual as prescribed by religious law, but also in practical terms. She readies her body to be observed, to be displayed, to be utilized as an instrument. The bathing requires time. She is meticulous. This is not the basic washing of hands and face that daily existence requires. This is comprehensive cleansing. When she steps from the bath, her skin is clean for the first occasion in days. In the midst of a settlement perishing from lack of water, Judith has employed water for beautification. The difference is striking, but the objective requires it. Next arrives the anointing. Judith possesses oils and fragrances stored away, luxuries she has not touched since Manasseh's passing. Presents he provided for her, costly imports, the variety of scents that prosperous women wear to attract notice. She opens vessels that have remained sealed for years. The aromas fill the chamber, rich, potent, sensual. She applies the oils with attention to her skin, to her hair. She does not merely apply them lightly. She anoints herself as though readying for a sacred ceremony. In a certain respect, she is. What she readies to accomplish is sacred in its objective, if troubling in its methods. The fragrances will function as protection of a different variety. They will announce her arrival. They will communicate her position. They will identify her as a woman of prosperity and cultivation. Her hair receives particular attention. For 3 years, she has maintained it plainly bound, covered, concealed, the custom of mourning. Yet now, she releases it. She combs it with care. She arranges it in the fashion of noble women, the variety of hairstyle that demands effort, that communicates leisure, that attracts the gaze. Her hair becomes part of the display, part of the weapon, then the clothing. This is perhaps the most striking change. Judith approaches a chest that has sat unopened for 3 years. Inside rest the garments she wore prior to Manasseh's passing, the fine robes, the quality fabrics, the variety of clothing that displays prosperity and standing. She has not examined these garments since she stored them away in sorrow. Now she removes them and examines them. She selects with care, not the most conservative options, not the plain robes. She chooses clothing designed to attract notice, to emphasize her beauty, to display her as desirable. The garments are expertly crafted, costly, cut to enhance appearance. The fabrics are gentle and fine. The colors are deep. When she puts them on, she is transformed. The jewelry arrives next. Judith owns considerable pieces inherited from Manasseh: gold, silver, valuable stones. For 3 years, these treasures have remained in containers, unused and disregarded. Now she retrieves them. Bracelets for her wrists, rings for her fingers, necklaces for her throat, earrings. Each piece is selected for impact. Together, they form an image of prosperity and position. They declare that she is someone significant, someone deserving of notice. She adds anklets. The text makes particular mention of these decorative chains worn around the ankles that produce sound during movement. They attract attention to the feet and legs. They generate a variety of music through motion. They are feminine, enticing, intentional. Judith has not worn such items since her marriage. Now she fastens them around her ankles and feels their weight, hears their sound, understands what message they transmit. Sandals finalize the outfit, not the basic footwear of daily existence. Elaborate sandals suitable for a woman of rank, decorated, skillfully made. Another detail in the overall display. Every element holds significance. Every choice adds to the image she must project. When the transformation reaches completion, Judith observes herself. She has not witnessed this version of herself in years. The widow has disappeared. The woman looking back from any reflective surface is beautiful, impressive, arresting. The variety of woman who would attract every gaze in a chamber. The variety of woman a general might desire. The variety of woman who could approach power. Her servant stares in astonishment. She has served Judith for years. She has grown familiar with the simple widow, with the woman in sackcloth who devoted her days to prayer. This transformation is almost beyond belief. It reveals capacities she never suspected. It displays a dimension of her mistress that has remained hidden. The servant realizes that she has been serving someone more complex than she understood. Judith directs her servant to ready provisions. They will require food for the journey and for their time in the hostile encampment. Yet here Judith is specific. She will consume only kosher food, only items prepared according to her religious law. She will not compromise on this point, even while compromising on numerous others. The food goes into a bag that her servant will transport. Wine as well, roasted grain, cakes of dried fruit, figs, cheese prepared properly, sufficient for multiple days. The difference is striking. Judith adorns herself like a courtesan, but preserves dietary laws like a priest. She employs her attractiveness as a weapon, but refuses to violate food regulations. The selective nature of her compromise reveals something about her thinking. Some things are instruments that can be employed. Other things are core identity that cannot be forsaken. She will bend, but not shatter. She will adapt, but not abandon her faith. As evening approaches, the time for departure draws near. Judith gathers what courage remains. The transformation is finalized. The provisions stand ready. The strategy is established. Now arrives the most difficult part, walking out of safety into peril, leaving the familiar for the unfamiliar, trusting that God will honor her faith sufficiently to protect her in her deception. Her servant observes her mistress with a mixture of reverence and fear. She has consented to accompany Judith on this venture. She will transport the provisions. She will support whatever strategy her mistress has conceived. She will remain faithful even though she does not fully comprehend. This is the variety of servant who makes unlikely strategies possible. Someone willing to place confidence, someone willing to accept risk, someone willing to follow into darkness. Judith takes one final look at her upper chamber, the space that has served as her sanctuary, the location where she has devoted countless hours in prayer, the room that knows her sorrow and her devotion. She does not know if she will return here. The strategy might not succeed. She might perish in the Assyrian encampment. This could be the final time she observes this chamber. The thought brings momentary sadness, but she pushes it aside. There is no space for sentiment now. Only action. She descends from her chamber. The widow who climbed the stairs 3 years ago is not the woman who descends now. Everything has changed. Everything has transformed. The woman in widow's garments has become the woman in fine robes. The mourner has become the seductress. The woman of prayer has become the warrior. And Bethulia's salvation walks in sandals that create music with every step. Beyond the gates, a leap of faith. Darkness settles fully upon Bethulia. The hour has arrived. Judith and her servant move through the silent streets toward the entrance. Few people are outside at this hour. Most are in their residences, conserving energy, enduring thirst, waiting for whatever the next day delivers. Those who do observe Judith passing are too weakened or too astonished to react immediately. Who is this beautiful woman moving through their dying settlement? Where is she proceeding in such finery? Word has reached the gate sentries that Judith will be arriving. Uzziah has kept his word. He has directed the watchman to permit her passage without inquiry. Still, when she arrives at the entrance, the men stare. They have known Judith by reputation. Some have observed her occasionally in her widow's garments. None have observed her like this. The transformation stuns them into silence. She addresses the sentries formally. She identifies herself, though they already know who she is. She requests that they open the entrance. She states that she is descending into the valley. She provides no explanation. None is necessary. The orders from Uzziah are clear. Let her pass. The sentries hesitate despite their instructions. Opening the entrance at night is dangerous. The Assyrians patrol the valley. What if this is perceived as an attack? What if soldiers rush the open entrance? Yet Judith's calm assurance steadies them. She is not afraid. Why should they be? They operate the mechanism. The heavy entrance swings open slowly, its hinges protesting. Beyond the entrance lies darkness, broken only by distant Assyrian campfires. The valley floor is perhaps half a mile below, down steep paths. The descent will be treacherous in the dark, but waiting until daylight defeats the objective. Judith requires the cover of darkness for the initial part of her journey. She must reach the valley without being clearly observed from the settlement. People might attempt to stop her if they fully understood what she was doing. Judith steps through the entrance. Her servant follows, carrying the bag of provisions. The sentries observe them depart, these two women walking into the valley controlled by the enemy, walking toward a military force of thousands, walking into a situation that seems certain to end in death or capture. The sentries do not comprehend. They cannot envision what Judith plans. They can only observe and wonder and pray. The entrance closes behind them. The sound of its shutting seems final, irreversible. Judith and her servant are now outside the walls, outside the protection of Bethulia, outside the community they belong to. They are between worlds, no longer safe in the settlement, not yet in the possession of the Assyrians, just two figures in darkness, descending a mountain path. The path is steep and rocky. In daylight, it requires attention. In darkness, it demands extreme caution. Judith moves carefully. Her sandals are not ideal for this terrain. The jewelry she wears creates noise with every step. The perfume that seemed appropriate in her chamber now feels excessive in the open air. Everything about her current situation is wrong from a practical perspective, but everything is correct for her objective. Her servant stays close. The faithful attendant manages the provisions bag while navigating the difficult path. She does not complain. She does not question. She simply follows. Judith is grateful for this loyalty. What she attempts would be impossible alone. She requires someone with her, someone who can witness, someone who can assist, someone who can carry what must be carried when the crucial moment arrives. They descend slowly. Above them, Bethulia disappears into darkness. The settlement that has been Judith's entire world recedes. Below them, the Assyrian fires grow closer. The encampment spreads across the valley floor, a temporary city of soldiers and siege equipment. Somewhere in that vast encampment sits Holofernes, the man she must reach, the target of her strategy, the one whose death might scatter this entire military force. The contrast between the two women and the vast military force is absurd. What can two people accomplish against thousands? What difference can one widow make against an empire's military? The logical mind would say none. The practical mind would counsel retreat. Yet Judith's mind operates on different principles. She believes in a God who employs weak things to shame the strong, who selects unlikely instruments for significant purposes, who delights in demonstrating power through the powerless. As they near the valley floor, sounds reach them, the normal noises of a military encampment at night, conversations, laughter, the movements of horses and equipment, someone singing, the clang of metal. This is not a military on alert. This is a military confident of victory, soldiers at ease, waiting for a starving settlement to surrender. They do not anticipate danger. They certainly do not anticipate two women walking toward them in the darkness. Judith pauses before the final descent. This is the point of no return. Once they reach the valley floor, once they are spotted by Assyrian patrols, there is no going back. The strategy must proceed to completion or to failure. There is no middle ground, no safe retreat, no possibility of changing her mind. She breathes deeply. She prays silently. She steadies herself. And then she continues down. They reach the valley floor, solid ground after the treacherous descent. For a moment they stand in the darkness, between the mountain and the encampment. This is the space between worlds. Behind them their people die slowly. Before them their enemies live comfortably. And they are two women alone in the middle, preparing to attempt something that has never been accomplished. Judith adjusts her robes. She verifies that her appearance is still perfect, despite the climb down. The jewelry must be visible, the clothing must be arranged correctly. Everything depends on the first impression. She must appear like a woman of position, fleeing to save herself, not like someone intent on eliminating her target. The performance begins now. She takes her servant's arm. They walk forward together toward the nearest Assyrian fires. They make no attempt to hide, no effort to sneak past patrols. They walk openly, boldly, as though they possess every right to be there. This is not how spies approach. This is not how soldiers attack. This is how important people move, with confidence, with the assumption that their presence will be accepted. The Assyrian encampment spreads before them, vast, organized, powerful. Somewhere in that maze of tents and soldiers, Holofernes sleeps or plans or celebrates his anticipated victory. Somewhere in there is the man whose death will change everything. Judith walks toward that somewhere. She walks toward her destiny. She walks toward the moment she has prepared for, and behind her, the gates of Bethulia are closed. There is no going back, only forward, only into the encampment, only toward the confrontation that will determine whether her people live or die. The first test, captured by the outpost. The Assyrian patrol spots them quickly. Two figures approaching from the direction of Bethulia, moving openly, not attempting concealment. The soldiers are alert immediately. This is unusual, unexpected. People fleeing a besieged settlement typically try to sneak away at night, hoping to slip past the patrols. These two walk directly toward the encampment, as though reporting for duty. The patrol moves to intercept. 4 soldiers armed with spears and swords. They surround Judith and her servant with practiced efficiency. Their weapons are raised, but not threatening yet. They are curious, more than alarmed. 2 women, one of them dressed like nobility, walking into an Assyrian encampment. This requires explanation. The patrol leader steps forward. He is a veteran, his face weathered by campaigns. He has observed strange things in his years of military service, but this ranks among the stranger. He addresses Judith in Aramaic, the common language of the region. He asks who she is, where she comes from, what she wants. Judith does not display fear. This is crucial. Fear would identify her as a victim, as someone powerless. Instead, she projects calm authority. She speaks Aramaic fluently, her voice steady and clear. She identifies herself as a Hebrew woman from Bethulia. She states that she has fled the settlement, and she declares that she possesses information for General Holofernes, important information that will help him take Judea without losing a single soldier. The soldiers exchange glances. They have heard many claims from prisoners and refugees. Most prove worthless, yet this woman's manner is different. Her confidence, her appearance, the way she speaks, she does not beg for mercy. She does not plead for her life. She offers them something valuable, information, intelligence that their general will want to hear. The patrol leader looks at Judith more carefully. He observes the fine clothing, the jewelry, the obvious prosperity. This is not a common refugee. This is a woman of position, a noble woman from the besieged settlement. Her claim to possess information becomes more credible. People of her class would know things, would comprehend the strategic situation, would have intelligence worth reporting. He also observes her beauty in the firelight. Even after the difficult descent, Judith is striking. The soldiers notice. They are men who have been on campaign for months. They have not observed women like this in a long time. Her appearance works in her favor. Beautiful women are treated differently than ordinary refugees. This is not justice. This is not right. Yet it is reality. And Judith employs it. The patrol leader makes his decision. He will take these women to his superior. Let someone higher in the command structure decide what to do with them. He cannot simply send away someone claiming to possess important intelligence for the general. If she truly has valuable information and he turned her away, he would face severe punishment. Better to pass the responsibility upward. He tells Judith that she and her servant will come with the patrol. His tone is firm, but not cruel. They are being detained, not arrested, escorted, not captured. The distinction is subtle, but real. Judith accepts this with a slight nod. She expected this. This is part of the strategy. She must be taken deeper into the encampment, closer to Holofernes. The patrol is facilitating exactly what she wants. The soldiers form around them, 2 in front, 2 behind. The patrol leader walks beside Judith. They move into the encampment past rows of tents. Other soldiers notice them passing. Word spreads quickly in a military encampment. 2 women from Bethulia, one of them beautiful, walking with the patrol, proceeding to headquarters. Men emerge from tents to observe, to stare, to comment among themselves. Judith maintains her composure. She walks through the encampment as though she belongs there, as though being escorted by soldiers is normal, as though the hundreds of eyes watching her do not exist. Her servant stays close, carrying the provisions bag. The faithful attendant shows no fear either. She takes her cue from her mistress. If Judith is calm, she will be calm. They pass the cooking fires, where evening meals are being prepared. The smell of food fills the air, meat roasting, bread baking, soldiers well supplied by their empire. The contrast with starving Bethulia is stark. These men eat freely while a settlement above them dies of hunger and thirst. War is never fair. The strong feast while the weak suffer. The patrol leads them toward the center of the encampment, toward the area where officers have their tents, toward the command section. Judith notes the layout as they walk, the organization, the spacing of tents, the location of supplies. She is gathering intelligence even while being detained. Everything she observes might prove useful. They approach a larger tent, more elaborate than the common soldiers' shelters. This belongs to someone with rank. The patrol leader calls out, announces that he has prisoners, 2 women from Bethulia. One claims to possess information for the general. A figure emerges from the tent, an officer, cleanly dressed, well-groomed, authority in his bearing. The officer looks at Judith. His expression changes from annoyance at being disturbed to interest at what he observes. Another man, noticing her beauty. Another person whose reactions she can predict and employ. The officer asks the patrol leader for his report. The soldier explains where he found them, what Judith claimed, what he decided to do. The officer steps closer. He addresses Judith directly. He asks her to repeat her claim. She does so with the same confidence as before. She is a Hebrew woman from Bethulia. She has fled because she knows the settlement will fall. She possesses information that General Holofernes needs, information about how to take all of Judea without battle, without losing men, without risk. The officer is intrigued despite himself. He asks why she would betray her own people. Judith has her answer ready. She explains that her people have sinned, that they have violated their religious laws, that God has abandoned them because of their violations, that she has come to the Assyrians because she knows they will win, that she wants to be on the winning side rather than die with the defeated. This explanation makes sense to Assyrian ears. They know that the Hebrew people claim special divine protection. They know that Hebrews believe their God fights for them. If a Hebrew woman says her people have lost that protection, it fits their understanding. It explains why she would flee, why she would offer help. Theological betrayal makes sense as motivation. The officer considers his options. He could simply ignore this woman, send her away. Yet what if she truly possesses valuable intelligence? What if her information could save the general time and lives? Officers who pass up such opportunities find their careers stalled. Better to let someone more senior decide whether she is worth hearing. He tells Judith that he will take her to see General Holofernes, that the general will decide whether her information is valuable, that she should prepare to speak persuasively because the general does not tolerate wasted time. Judith assures him she is ready. She has not come all this way to waste anyone's time. She has come to serve the great general, to help him achieve his victory, to ensure that the power of Assyria receives the glory it deserves. The officer orders the patrol to continue escorting the women. He joins them himself. They walk deeper into the encampment, toward the heart of Assyrian power, toward the tent of Holofernes himself. Judith's heartbeat quickens slightly, though she displays no external sign. This is happening. Her strategy is working. She is being taken exactly where she must go. The first test has been passed. The next test will be far more difficult. Yet for now, she has accomplished what needed to be accomplished. She has gotten inside. She has been believed. And she is on her way to meet the man whose life she has come to end. The audience, facing Holofernes. The tent rose before her like a temple to human power. Silk hung from every post. Gold vessels caught the lamplight and threw it back in waves across tables laden with food. The air itself seemed heavy with perfume and wine. This was the heart of the Assyrian war machine, and Judith walked into it alone. Holofernes sat at the center of it all. His presence filled the space the way a storm fills the sky. Years of conquest had carved themselves into his features. His hands had directed the fate of cities. His word had sent thousands to their end. Now those eyes turned toward the woman standing at the entrance of his tent. The general's officers lined the walls, battle-worn men who had observed every trick, every deception. They watched this Hebrew woman with the careful attention soldiers give to unexpected things. Their silence created a weight in the air. Every word Judith spoke would be tested against their experience. She did not bow. She did not tremble. Instead, she lowered herself with the grace of someone honoring a king by choice, not from fear. When she rose, her voice carried clearly through the tent. "May my lord live forever," she began, the ancient greeting of courts and palaces. She knew their language. She knew their customs. Holofernes leaned forward. Something in her bearing had caught him. Perhaps it was the calm in her eyes. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, neither broken nor defiant, but composed. She did not look like a refugee from a dying city. She looked like nobility seeking an audience. "Speak," he said, the command of a man used to quick answers. Yet Judith did not rush. She let that moment settle. She understood that power lies not just in words, but in the spaces between them. Her servant stood behind her, silent as a shadow. The food bag hung at the servant's side, containing the provisions Judith had brought from Bethulia, clean food, pure food, the kind a faithful Hebrew woman would carry to maintain her devotion even in enemy territory. It was a detail that would matter. Everything about Judith was a detail that would matter. She began to weave her story. The God of heaven had turned his face from her people. Their sins had piled too high. They had broken sacred law. Even now, in their desperation, they planned to consume food forbidden to them, to eat the first fruits meant for the temple, to drink the sacred oil. This final transgression would seal their fate. The words flowed with the rhythm of prophecy. Judith spoke of divine anger the way priests speak of holy things, with certainty, with reverence, with the weight of ages behind each phrase. She had come to save her own life, yes, but more than that, she had come to offer Holofernes something no spy could give him, the exact moment of his enemy's collapse. "When they commit this sin," she said, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, "God will deliver them into your hand. You will march through all the lands unopposed. No one will resist you." The officers shifted. They had heard many desperate people offer many desperate bargains. Yet this woman spoke differently. She did not beg. She did not plead. She offered information the way a merchant offers rare goods, with confidence in their value. Holofernes studied her face. He had interrogated prisoners. He had listened to traders. He knew the look of someone inventing a story under pressure. This woman showed none of those signs. Her gaze remained steady. Her hands did not fidget. She stood in the presence of the most dangerous man in the known world and spoke to him as though she belonged there. "How will you know when this sin occurs?" he asked. A test, a probe for weakness in her account. Judith did not hesitate. "God will reveal it to me through prayer. Each night I must go out to the ravine to pray. He will tell me when the transgression has happened. Then I will come to you, and you will go forth with your army. Not a dog will growl at you." It was brilliant. She had just secured her own freedom of movement. Every night she could leave the encampment. Every night she could maintain her ritual purity, eat her own food, pray to her own God, and they would let her go, believing she was their oracle, their key to bloodless victory. The general smiled. It was not a kind smile, but it carried a certain pleasure. Here was a Hebrew woman of obvious intelligence, of clear beauty, offering him everything he wanted. The siege at Bethulia had been effective, but slow. His master, the king, wanted results, swift results. This woman promised him speed and certainty. "Your God has done well to send you to us," Holofernes said. His voice carried approval now, even warmth. "When we accomplish these things, your God shall be my God. You will live in the palace of the king and be renowned throughout the earth." His officers nodded. Some smiled. They saw what their commander saw, a clever woman choosing the winning side. It made sense. Why should she die with her people when she could live in luxury? Why should she perish in a siege when she could walk free? It was the rational choice, the survival choice. Yet they did not see what Judith saw. They did not understand the fire that had driven her from her home. They could not comprehend the prayer she had prayed in the darkness of her chamber, the petition for strength to accomplish what her hands must do. They saw a traitor. She knew herself to be a weapon. Holofernes called for his servants. "Prepare a tent for her. Give her from my own table. Provide her with wine from my own stores." Judith lowered her eyes, the picture of grateful humility. "I cannot eat the food of my Lord, lest it become an offense to me. I have brought provisions that will suffice." The general waved his hand. "As you wish. But when your provisions run out, where will you get more?" She looked up at him then, and something flickered in her expression, a hint of knowing, a touch of prophecy. "Before my supplies are exhausted, the Lord will accomplish by my hand what he has determined." The words hung in the air. Later, men would remember them. Later, they would understand what she had actually said. Yet in that moment, drunk on anticipated victory, they heard only what they wanted to hear. They thought she spoke of leading them to conquest. They did not realize she spoke of their destruction. Holofernes dismissed her with honor. Guards escorted her to a tent near the edge of the encampment, not among the common soldiers, but in the section reserved for valued advisors and honored guests. She would be watched, yes, but she would also be protected. They had made her valuable. They had given her position, and with position came freedom. As Judith walked through the encampment to her new quarters, soldiers stopped to stare. Word had already spread, the beautiful Hebrew woman who had defected, the prophetess who would deliver victory. They observed her fine clothing, her jewels, her composed bearing. They saw confirmation of everything they believed about the weakness of their enemies. Judith entered her tent and allowed herself one deep breath. The first test had passed. She had walked into the mouth of the lion and emerged unharmed. Yet this was only the beginning. Now came the harder part. Now came the waiting. Now came the building of trust, until the moment arrived when trust became a fatal weakness. Her servant sat down the food bag and looked at her mistress. No words passed between them. None were needed. They both understood. They had entered a place of death, and they would either bring death with them when they left, or they would not leave at all. Outside, the Assyrian encampment settled into its evening rhythms. Fires were lit, guards changed shifts, officers reported to their commanders. the great war machine prepared for another day of siege. And in a tent at the edge of it all, a widow from Bethulia began her vigil. The web of words. Judith's masterful deception. Morning arrived with the sound of armies waking. Horns signaled the change of watch. Men emerged from tents, stretching, talking, preparing for another day of waiting. The siege at Bethulia continued, but something had shifted in the encampment. Everyone knew about the Hebrew woman. Everyone had an opinion. Judith rose before dawn. She had slept little, but her face showed no fatigue. Her servant helped her dress, not in the elaborate garments of the previous night, but in clothes that were still fine, still beautiful, yet more appropriate for daylight. Everything had to be calibrated. Too much wealth and she seemed false. Too little, and she lost the aura of nobility that protected her. She walked through the encampment to the ravine. The guards who watched her noted the direction she took, the prayers she murmured, the way she knelt by the water. They observed a religious woman maintaining her devotions. They did not observe the steel beneath the piety. They could not imagine that devotion to her God was exactly what made her dangerous. When she returned, Holofernes summoned her. He wanted to hear more. He wanted her prophecies, her insights, her knowledge of Hebrew customs and weaknesses. Judith came willingly. She sat where he indicated. She accepted water but not wine, and she began to teach her enemies exactly how to think about her people. The Hebrews are protected only so long as they do not sin against their God, she explained. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had studied scripture all her life, which she had. Every word she spoke was technically true. The deception lay not in false facts, but in false implications. She described the laws of her people, the rituals, the festivals, the sacred obligations. Holofernes listened with the attention of a general studying an enemy's defenses. His officers took notes. They asked questions. How many fighting men? What supplies remained? How long before thirst broke their will? Judith answered everything. She spoke of Bethulia's wells now dry. She spoke of the cisterns carefully rationed. She spoke of the desperation in the streets, the arguments, the breaking faith. All of this was true. All of it confirmed what Assyrian scouts had already reported, which made her other claims seem equally reliable. They have set a limit, she said, her voice dropping. 5 days. If God does not deliver them in 5 days, they will surrender. This too was true. Uzziah's promise echoed through Bethulia. Everyone knew the deadline, yet Judith did not mention her own rebuke of that promise. She did not speak of her prayer for strength to act. She gave her enemies the truth in pieces, carefully selected, strategically arranged. Holofernes smiled. 5 days. He could wait 5 days. After months of campaigning, 5 days felt like nothing. And this woman promised him that even those 5 days might not be necessary. She would know through her prayers the exact moment of divine abandonment. She would tell him when to strike. The general's confidence swelled, filling the space around him. His words painted scenes of conquest. The campaign he'd waged, cities that had crumbled, kingdoms forced into submission. He described an inevitable sweep of power, a world bound together beneath a single authority. Judith absorbed every word with what appeared to be genuine fascination. The questions she posed appealed directly to his pride. She expressed wonder at his strategic mind. She transformed herself into the ideal listener for someone who took pleasure in the sound of his own voice. During the intervals between these meetings, Judith kept to her pattern. 3 times daily, she made her way to the ravine. Her prayers were directed toward Jerusalem. She cleansed herself, using water drawn from the spring. Her meals consisted solely of provisions her maid had prepared from their own supplies. The guards became accustomed to her rhythms. What had seemed unusual initially became unremarkable by day 3. This shift was essential. Judith needed the encampment to cease paying attention to her presence. She required her movements to blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday routines. Soldiers remain vigilant when watching for unusual behavior. They stay alert for attempted escapes, acts of sabotage, betrayal. However, routine transforms people into something invisible. Routine grants unspoken permission. Simultaneously, she constructed a mental map of the entire camp. She took note of where the commander's quarters were located. She tracked the timing of guard rotations. Conversations between officers revealed the command structure to her listening ears. Who answered to whom, where actual authority resided versus where rank merely existed. Each piece of intelligence accumulated in her memory like currency gathering in a purse. Meanwhile, Holofernes grew more and more satisfied with his acquisition. He mentioned her to fellow commanders. "Have you laid eyes on the Hebrew woman? Such brilliance, such beauty. Her own people are foolish to have let her slip away." His subordinates voiced their agreement. They'd all noticed her moving throughout the camp. A few had exchanged brief words with her. She offered courtesy to everyone, yet she saved her genuine focus exclusively for Holofernes. This, too, was deliberate. Judith had a deep understanding of men. She grasped how desire functions, how scarcity increases worth. By maintaining friendliness toward all, while reserving intimacy for the general alone, she elevated her own value. She became something rare, something worthy of possession. On day 3, she informed Holofernes about the sacred oil. "Once my people consume what has been set aside for the temple," she explained, "that will represent the ultimate transgression. God will reveal this to me during my prayers that night, and come morning you'll advance toward guaranteed triumph." The general reclined in his seat. "How much longer?" "Very soon," Judith responded. "My provisions are nearly depleted. Before they run out entirely, everything will reach its conclusion." Another statement that held truth, yet conveyed entirely different meanings to speaker and listener. Holofernes interpreted a promise of approaching victory. Judith declared a promise of imminent action. The language remained identical. The underlying intentions stood in opposition. That evening, returning from her prayers, Judith passed a cluster of soldiers gambling with dice. Their conversation halted as she drew near, then picked up again once she'd gone by. One of them muttered a comment about Hebrew women. Another released a laugh. They perceived her not as a threat. To them, she was merely a curiosity, an oddity, a woman displaced but essentially harmless. Perfect. Inside her tent, Judith permitted her maid to brush through her hair. The familiar motion brought a measure of comfort. For just an instant, she could imagine herself back in Bethulia, in her own dwelling, maintaining the quiet rhythms of her widowed life. Then memory returned, her actual location, her actual purpose. "Tomorrow," she whispered to her maid. "Tomorrow brings his invitation to feast with him." The maid's hands hesitated for the briefest moment before resuming their work. She understood the significance. Both of them recognized the approaching moment. Following all the preparation, all the prayers, all the meticulous construction of trust and longing, the trap stood nearly complete. Judith let her eyes close. Thoughts of Bethulia filled her mind. Her people, consumed by thirst and desperation. Uzziah's 5-day deadline, now reduced to merely 2 remaining days. Children weeping for water. Elderly men too weakened to rise, women clutching empty containers, overcome with grief. Thoughts of Manasseh, her husband, dead these past 3 years. She wondered how he would perceive her now. Would understanding reach him? Would he recognize his wife within this being of calculated deception and lethal purpose? Or had she evolved into someone completely different? The question offered no resolution. She had become what circumstances demanded. She'd prayed for God to employ her as his instrument. Instruments don't engage in self-questioning. Instruments simply fulfill their designed function. Beyond the tent walls, the camp settled into quiet. Guards assumed their positions. Officers withdrew to their quarters. Holofernes sat inside his space, consuming wine, contemplating the Hebrew woman and the victory she'd promised. He remained unaware he was contemplating his own end. He couldn't conceive that the answer to all his schemes sat merely 3 tents distant, waiting. Judith's eyes opened. Tomorrow. Everything hinged on tomorrow. She'd woven the web. Strand by delicate strand, she'd positioned herself at its center. Now nothing remained except waiting for the spider to approach. She knelt for one final prayer, not requesting success, not seeking safety, but asking for strength, for steadiness of hand and clarity of mind, for the capacity to execute what necessity demanded, without hesitation, without compassion, without uncertainty. Night deepened around her. Stars turned their slow wheel overhead, and inside a tent within the Assyrian encampment, a widow prepared herself for battle. A privileged guest, existence within the enemy stronghold. Days assumed a pattern. Morning arrived with the sounds of the camp awakening, thousands of men stirring into activity. Judith rose earlier than most of them. She dressed with deliberate care, each garment selected to preserve the image she'd constructed. Then she walked toward the ravine while dew still clung to the blades of grass. Guards no longer challenged her. They offered nods as she passed. Some even smiled. She'd integrated into the landscape, as familiar as supply wagons and morning exercises. This familiarity served her needs precisely. Routine granted freedom of movement. Predictability rendered her seemingly harmless. At the ravine, she performed her ritual cleansing. The water flowed cold and pure across her hands, her face, her feet. She turned her face toward Jerusalem for prayer. Her lips formed words from psalms, from supplications, from praise. Any observer would witness only devotion. They couldn't detect the steel running beneath those prayers. They couldn't sense the warrior's heart beating in rhythm with the worshipper's words. She made her way back to her tent as sunlight climbed higher. Her maid had arranged a modest meal from their provisions: bread, cheese, dried fruit. Plain fare, yet clean according to the laws they observed. Judith consumed it slowly, mindfully. She maintained every appearance of being someone governed by religious law. This wasn't performance. She genuinely upheld these customs. Yet she also comprehended how they advanced her larger objective. Mid-morning frequently brought a messenger from Holofernes. The general desired her presence. He had inquiries. He sought her perspectives. Sometimes he simply wanted her company, the pleasure of conversation with someone whose intellect matched his own sharpness. Judith always complied. She never delayed him, though neither did she hurry. She moved throughout the camp with quiet dignity, observing everything. Which officers showed signs of excessive drinking? Which soldiers appeared restless? Where weapons were stored? How horses were guarded? Information flowed into her awareness like water filling a vessel. Inside Holofernes' tent, she executed her role flawlessly. She addressed his questions regarding Hebrew customs and military preparedness. She celebrated his strategic brilliance. She responded with laughter to his jokes. She became essential without appearing to try, which represents manipulation at its highest form. The general shared his maps with her. He laid out his plans for the broader campaign. Once Bethulia collapsed, his forces would sweep southward. Jerusalem would follow, then the coastal settlements, then everything extending to Egypt's borders. He discussed it like someone describing weather patterns. Inevitable, natural, already accomplished within his mind. Judith listened with widened eyes. She posed innocent questions that permitted him to elaborate, thereby feeling clever. But what about the mountain passes, she might inquire? Or how will supplies support such a massive force across that distance? Each question fed his need to display mastery. Each response provided her additional insight into Assyrian military thinking. Occasionally, other officers joined these sessions. They too harbored curiosity about the Hebrew woman. Some carried suspicion. Their eyes held doubt, even while their mouths formed courtesies. Judith didn't overextend herself trying to win them. That would appear false. Instead, she remained consistently herself, devout, intelligent, gracious, and clearly aligned with Assyrian triumph. The suspicious ones gradually eased. She never altered her narrative, she never faltered. Her prayers remained public and regular. Her adherence to Hebrew law stayed absolute. She appeared precisely as she claimed, a righteous woman, abandoning a sinful people, selecting life over meaningless death. Afternoons brought different rhythms. The camp grew hot and motionless. Men sought shade. Activity diminished. Judith returned to her tent for rest, though sleep rarely came. She prayed, she contemplated, she rehearsed mentally what approached, every movement, every word, every potential complication, and her response. Her maid sat close by, mending or preparing food. The two women exchanged few words, yet their silence held communion. They'd served together across years. The maid knew Judith's patterns, her thoughts, her faith. She'd chosen to accompany this mission, fully aware it might conclude with both their deaths. That depth of loyalty cannot be commanded. It emerges only through years of mutual respect. Evening brought Judith back to the ravine for the second daily prayer time. Guards observed her descending the path, kneeling beside the water, lifting her face toward the darkening sky. They witnessed devotion. They didn't recognize reconnaissance. Each journey taught her more about the terrain, the sightlines, the distance separating camp from wilderness. Each journey prepared her for the escape that must eventually come. Sometimes, returning from evening prayers, she passed clusters of soldiers gathered around fires. They called out, "Greetings." "Lady Judith," they'd shout, "has your God spoken yet?" She would smile and tell them soon, very soon. They laughed and returned to their dice games and storytelling. To them, she was entertainment, an exotic addition to the tedium of siege warfare. This casual acceptance held immense value. It signified they didn't fear her. It meant they wouldn't be watching carefully when the critical moment arrived. Men don't anticipate danger from women. They especially don't anticipate danger from religious women who pray 3 times daily and maintain dietary restrictions. Their assumptions became her weapon. Back inside her tent each night, Judith consumed her evening meal. The provisions she'd brought from Bethulia were diminishing. This wasn't accidental. She'd calculated precisely how long they'd endure, long enough to establish routine, not so long that Holofernes might lose interest. On the second night, a servant arrived bearing a message. The general extended an invitation for her to dine with him the following evening. A private feast, just the two of them, plus a few close attendants. Judith received the invitation with a slight bow and a smile. "Convey to your lord that I am honored and will attend." The servant departed. The tent flap fell closed. Judith looked toward her maid. Both understood completely. The moment had arrived. Following all the preparation, all the patience, all the careful theater, the trap stood ready to close. Now arrived the most dangerous part. Now came the test of nerve and faith. That night Judith prayed longer than usual. She knelt until her knees ached against the tent floor. She poured her heart before the God of her fathers. She requested strength. She requested clarity. She requested that her hand remain steady when the time arrived. She didn't request safety. She'd surrendered safety the instant she walked through Bethulia's gates. The camp surrounding her gradually quieted. Fires burned low. Conversations faded. Guards changed shifts with soft calls and shuffling feet. The entire vast machinery of war settled into rest. And in the midst of it all, a widow prepared herself for violence. She contemplated what approached, not merely the act itself, but its meaning. She would take a life, not in battle, not in self-defense, but through deliberate, premeditated action. The morality of it pressed against her soul. Was this righteous? Was this murder? Or did it represent something else entirely? An execution, a judgment carried out by human hands under divine direction. She possessed no answer. She knew only that her people faced death. She knew Holofernes would demonstrate no mercy once Bethulia fell. She knew that sometimes salvation demands terrible things. So she prayed for God to bless even the deceit, even the violence, even the blood that would soon stain her hands. Dawn arrived too quickly. Judith rose and dressed with extraordinary care. This would represent her final performance. Perfection was essential, not merely beautiful, but captivating, not merely charming, but irresistible. She had to make Holofernes believe that tonight, at last, she would be his. Her maid assisted with her finest garments. They applied perfume. They arranged her jewelry. They brushed her hair until it shone like dark water catching lamplight. When finished, Judith studied herself and barely recognized the woman, reflected in the polished bronze mirror. The widow from Bethulia had vanished. In her place stood a vision calculated to mesmerize a general drunk on anticipated conquest. Judith closed her eyes, breathing deeply. This represented the disguise. The real woman existed beneath it, praying, focused, deadly. The day stretched forward, hours of waiting, hours of maintaining composure, hours of quieting the fear that threatened to rise and strangle her. She walked to the ravine one final time. She prayed with special intensity. Upon returning, her face displayed only calm. Whatever storm raged internally, the surface showed merely peace. Afternoon arrived, then evening. Then a servant at her tent announcing that General Holofernes awaited her presence at his table. Judith stood. Her maid retrieved the food bag, still holding their own provisions, but also containing something else now, a cloth, an empty space, a preparation for what they hoped to carry back. Judith walked through the camp toward Holofernes' tent. The sun was descending, lamps were being lit. Soldiers watched her pass and called out admirations. She smiled, but maintained her pace. Her heartbeat, steady and strong. Fear had been consumed by prayer and purpose. At the entrance to the general's tent, guards pulled back the fabric. Light and music spilled outward. The scent of roasted meat and wine washed over her. Judith drew one final breath of outside air. Then she stepped forward into the trap she'd constructed, and the hunter walked straight toward the jaws of her own snare, unknowing that she'd already transformed into the prey. The invitation, the fateful banquet. The messenger arrived during afternoon light. He wore the insignia of Holofernes' personal staff, signaling the summons carried weight beyond ordinary courtesy. Judith received him at her tent's entrance. Her maid stood behind, silent as always, observing everything. "The General Holofernes requests the honor of your presence at a private banquet this evening," the messenger announced. His words held formality, yet his eyes carried a knowing expression. Everyone throughout the camp understood what a private banquet signified. This wasn't about food. Judith lowered her gaze in a gesture of modesty. "Convey to my lord that I am honored by his invitation. I will attend with gladness." The messenger bowed and departed. The moment he vanished from view, Judith turned toward her maid. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, yet understanding moved like lightning. This represented the moment they'd prepared for. This explained why they'd come. The maid began immediate preparations. She drew water for washing. She laid out Judith's finest garments, the ones carefully preserved throughout their days in camp. She prepared the food bag with special attention, ensuring everything occupied its proper place. Bread, cheese, wine from their own supply, and space, empty space that wouldn't remain empty if their plan succeeded. Judith bathed herself with ritual care. She'd already purified herself at the ravine that morning, yet this demanded something more. She needed to prepare not merely her body but her mind. Each washing motion became a prayer. Each breath transformed into a petition for strength. When she stood clean and damp, wrapped in linen, her maid brought the garments. The finest tunic, soft as clouds. Over that, a robe of deep blue embroidered with silver thread. Then the jewelry, earrings catching light, bracelets singing softly with movement, a pendant resting against her throat. Each piece had belonged to her late husband's family. Each piece spoke of wealth and status. Her maid arranged her hair, not in the simple style of widowhood, but in the elaborate fashion of a woman attending a feast. Oil scented with myrrh touched her temples, perfume anointed her wrists. When the transformation concluded, Judith stood before the small bronze mirror and studied her reflection. The widow had disappeared. In her place stood a woman of extraordinary beauty, dressed for seduction. Judith held her own gaze in the mirror. She saw the weapon she'd become, sharp and glittering, and designed for one purpose only. "Are you afraid?" her maid whispered. Judith considered the question. Fear occupied her chest, yet it wasn't the kind that paralyzes. It was the fear that sharpens, that focuses, that burns away everything except what must be accomplished. "I am terrified," Judith answered honestly. "But I am also certain. These two things can exist together." The maid nodded. She too felt afraid. She too held certainty. They'd cast their lot with God and with desperate hope that one woman's courage might achieve what an army could not. As the sun descended toward the horizon, Judith prepared her mind. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would move, what expressions she would wear. Every gesture had to appear natural while serving strategic purpose. She had to seem yielding while remaining in absolute control. She had to encourage his desire while managing its expression. Most crucially, she had to intoxicate him, not merely relaxed or merry, but thoroughly, completely drunk. Drunk enough that his guard would collapse. Drunk enough that his reflexes would fail. Drunk enough that when she reached for his sword, he would lack the ability to stop her. A horn sounded, marking the hour. The messenger returned. "My lord awaits." Judith wrapped a shawl of fine wool around her shoulders. Her maid retrieved the food bag, settling its weight carefully. Together, they walked through the camp as evening shadows lengthened around them. Soldiers stopped their activities to watch. Some whistled softly, others murmured appreciations. Words spread quickly through the tents. The Hebrew woman was going to Holofernes, dressed like a bride. Everyone knew what that meant. Everyone understood what would happen tonight. Let them think they understand, Judith thought. Let them believe they know how this story concludes. Holofernes' tent stood at the center of the command section, an enormous portable palace of silk and leather. Guards flanked the entrance, yet they stepped aside as Judith approached. One pulled back the flap and lamplight spilled into the gathering dusk. Inside, the transformation from military headquarters to pleasure pavilion was complete. Maps and weapons had been cleared away. In their place stood tables laden with food, roasted lamb, fresh bread, fruits that must have traveled from great distances. Wine flagons stood in rows, enough to intoxicate an entire unit. Holofernes rose from his couch as she entered. He wore his finest uniform, though he'd removed his armor. His sword hung on the tent post nearby, close enough to reach, yet not on his person. He appeared pleased, excited, hungry. "Lady Judith," he said, sweeping his arm toward the feast, "you honor me with your presence." She bowed gracefully. "The honor is mine, my lord. Your kindness to me has exceeded all measure." He gestured for her to recline on the couch opposite his own. Servants stood ready to pour wine, to serve food, to attend every need. Yet Holofernes waved most of them away. He desired privacy. He desired intimacy. Perfect. Judith settled onto the couch, arranging her robes carefully. Her maid placed the food bag within easy reach, then withdrew to the tent's edge, present yet unobtrusive. Holofernes poured wine with his own hands, filling his cup to the brim. "You have brought your own provisions," he observed, nodding toward her food bag. "Old habits die hard, my lord, yet perhaps tonight I might relax my customs somewhat." She let her voice carry a hint of possibility, a suggestion of flexibility. His eyes brightened. He lifted his cup. "To new beginnings." Judith reached for her own provisions, yet accepted a cup of his wine to make the toast. She touched it to her lips but barely drank. He, however, drained his cup and immediately refilled it. The feast began. Holofernes ate with enthusiasm, yet he drank with passion. Cup after cup disappeared down his throat. He spoke expansively of his victories, his plans, his vision for the future. Judith listened with apparent fascination, asking questions that prompted him to drink more as he answered. "You are the most remarkable woman I have met," he declared, his words beginning to slur slightly. "Beauty and intelligence together. Your people are fools." "Perhaps," Judith replied softly. "I am simply fortunate to have found wisdom in time." He laughed and drank again. Servants brought more food, more wine. The general consumed both without restraint. He was celebrating, he was relaxing, he was slowly yet certainly becoming drunk. Judith ate sparingly from her own food. She needed to remain sharp. Every sense had to stay alert. She watched his movements become looser, his speech more careless, his eyes more unfocused. She watched the man who commanded thousands become increasingly vulnerable. He began to speak of his desire for her, not crudely, yet clearly. He wanted her to remain with him. He wanted to reward her loyalty. He painted pictures of the life she could have at his side. Judith responded with blushes and smiles, encouraging without quite committing, keeping him interested, keeping him drinking. The evening wore on. Servants came and went, bringing more wine, clearing plates. Yet gradually Holofernes dismissed them. He wanted to be alone with his guest. He wanted no interruptions. One by one, the attendants bowed and withdrew, until only Judith, her maid, and the increasingly drunk general remained. Judith glanced toward the tent entrance. She noted where guards stood outside. She observed how the fabric walls muffled sound. She measured distances with her eyes, the sword on the tent post, the general on his couch, the space between. Holofernes poured another cup. His hand shook slightly. He drank it down and laughed at nothing in particular. His defenses were crumbling. The great warrior was becoming just a man alone with wine and desire, trusting the wrong person. "I think," he said, his words thick, "I think I have consumed more wine tonight than in any day of my life." Judith smiled gently. "Joy makes the wine taste sweeter, my lord." He reached toward her, and she allowed him to take her hand. His grip was warm yet clumsy. He pulled her slightly closer, and she didn't resist. Let him think she was yielding. Let him believe the night was progressing as he planned. Yet, as she moved, her eyes went to the sword again. Soon, very soon now. She simply had to wait a little longer, simply had to let the wine complete its work, simply had to pray that her nerve would hold when the moment arrived. Holofernes' eyes began to close. He fought it, wanting to stay awake, wanting to savor his anticipated conquest. Yet the wine was too much. The day had been long. His body demanded rest, even as his mind resisted. Judith watched carefully. This was the edge between opportunity and disaster. Too soon, and he might still be able to fight. Too late, and someone might check on him. The timing had to be perfect. The general's grip on her hand loosened, his breathing deepened. He slumped back against the cushions, still awake, yet barely. Judith waited, her heart pounding, her breath carefully controlled. And in the silence of the tent, with lamplight flickering and wine spilled across the table, the fate of nations, balanced on the edge of a blade not yet drawn. The feast of folly, Holofernes' final night. The wine flowed like a river in flood. Cup after cup disappeared down Holofernes' throat, as though he were attempting to drown something inside himself. Perhaps doubt, perhaps weariness. Perhaps simply the weight of commanding so many men across so many battles. Whatever he sought at the bottom of those cups, he pursued it with single-minded intensity. Judith watched him with careful eyes. She reclined across from him, appearing relaxed, occasionally sipping from her own cup, though she barely allowed the wine to touch her lips. Her food came from the bag her maid had prepared. Clean food, lawful food, food that wouldn't cloud her mind or slow her reflexes. She needed every advantage the night could provide. The general ate with less attention than he drank. Roasted lamb passed his lips, bread soaked in oil, dates sweet and soft. Yet food was merely an excuse for more wine. Between every few bites, his cup rose again and again and again. "You know," he said, his words beginning to blur at the edges, "I have conquered cities that thought themselves unconquerable. I have broken armies that believed themselves invincible." He gestured broadly, nearly knocking over a wine flagon. "Yet I have never encountered a woman like you." Judith smiled with appropriate modesty. "My lord flatters me beyond my worth." "No," he insisted, leaning forward with the earnest intensity of the drunk. "No, you are extraordinary. Intelligence and beauty together, such a rare thing." He drank again, emptying his cup, immediately refilling it. The servants had been dismissed an hour ago. Holofernes had waved them away with increasing impatience, desiring privacy, desiring the freedom to speak and act without witnesses. Now only Judith's maid remained, sitting quietly in the shadows near the tent wall, so still she might have been furniture. This isolation was precisely what Judith needed. No guards inside the tent, no servants to interrupt, just the general and his wine and the woman he thought he was seducing. He didn't realize he was the one being maneuvered, positioned, prepared. Holofernes began to talk about his plans for her. "When we take Jerusalem," he said, his voice thick with drink and desire, "you will have a place of honor, a palace, servants, whatever you desire." "You are too generous, my lord." "Not generous enough." He tried to focus his eyes on her face, yet seemed to be having difficulty. "A woman of your quality deserves the finest things, and I can provide them to you. Everything, anything." He reached across the space between their couches, attempting to touch her hand. Judith allowed it, though his grip was loose and uncertain. His coordination was deteriorating rapidly. "Good. That was good. I think," Judith said softly, letting her voice carry warmth, "that you have made me feel safer than I have felt since my husband passed." This pleased him enormously. He smiled wide and drank again, as though her words were worth celebrating. The cup emptied. He fumbled for the flagon and poured more, spilling some across the table. He didn't notice, or didn't care. "Your husband was a fool to die and leave you," Holofernes declared, with the absolute certainty of drunkenness. "If I had a wife like you, I would never die." Judith lowered her eyes. "Death comes for us all, my lord, even the mighty." Yet he was no longer listening. His attention had drifted to his cup again. He raised it, examined it as though seeing it for the first time, then drank. The wine was taking full effect now. His movements grew slower, his speech more slurred, his thoughts more scattered. He began to tell stories of battles, not the strategic discussions he'd shared earlier in the week, but the raw, bloody details. The cutting and the screaming, the terror in men's eyes as they fell. He spoke of these things with the casualness of someone describing weather, his moral sense dulled by wine and years of violence. Judith listened without flinching. She'd prepared herself for this. She knew what kind of man he was. Knowing it in abstract was different from hearing it directly, yet she didn't allow herself to react. She nodded. She murmured appropriate responses. She kept him talking and drinking. The night deepened. Lamps burned lower. Outside, the camp had gone quiet. Most soldiers were asleep. Guards walked their rounds at predictable intervals. The whole army rested, trusting in their strength, never imagining that inside the largest tent a carefully laid trap was closing. Holofernes tried to stand and nearly fell. He laughed at his own unsteadiness. "The wine is stronger tonight," he observed, as though the wine itself were at fault for his condition. "Perhaps my lord should rest," Judith suggested gently. "Rest? No, not yet." Yet even as he said it, his body betrayed him. He slumped back onto his couch, his head lolling. His eyes struggled to stay open. The wine had done its work thoroughly. Judith remained perfectly still. This was the moment of greatest danger. If he passed out completely, that was one thing. Yet if he remained in this twilight state, half-conscious and unpredictable, everything could collapse. She watched his breathing, measured its depth, assessed his level of consciousness. He mumbled something she couldn't make out. His hand moved toward his cup again, yet missed it entirely, his arm falling limp at his side. His eyes closed, opened, closed again. His chest rose and fell in the deep rhythm of approaching unconsciousness. "My lord," Judith said softly. No response. His breathing deepened further. The great general, commander of the Assyrian forces, conqueror of nations, lay sprawled across his couch in drunken stupor. All his power, all his might, all his careful strategy rendered meaningless by too much wine and misplaced trust. Judith looked toward her maid. Their eyes met across the tent. The maid's face showed no expression, yet Judith could read the question there. Now? Is it now? Not yet. Not quite yet. Judith needed certainty. She needed Holofernes to be deeply unconscious, beyond the possibility of waking easily. She waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. His breathing became the regular deep pattern of heavy sleep. Still she waited. She thought about the people of Bethulia. By now they were on their 4th day. One more remained before Uzziah's deadline. Tomorrow the council would meet to discuss surrender terms. Children would be crying from thirst. Women would be arguing with their husbands about whether to stay or flee. Men would be sharpening weapons they no longer believed they would use. She thought about the God she served. The God who had used Deborah to defeat Sisera, the God who had empowered Jael to drive a tent peg through an enemy's skull, the God who chose the weak things to shame the strong. She was weak, one woman against an army, yet weakness in the hands of God becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. Holofernes' breathing remained deep and steady. His mouth had fallen open. A small line of drool ran from the corner of his lips. The mighty general, reduced to this. Judith felt no satisfaction in it, only a cold acknowledgement of opportunity. She rose from her couch slowly, carefully. Her movements were measured and silent. She'd removed her jewelry earlier, piece by piece, setting them aside quietly, so that now she wore nothing that would jingle or shine. She'd prepared for this moment with the attention a soldier gives to readying weapons before battle. Her maid stood as well, moving to the entrance of the tent, positioning herself to watch for interruptions while maintaining the appearance of an attendant waiting patiently. Judith's eyes went to the sword hanging on the tent post, Holofernes' own weapon. The blade gleamed in the lamplight, beautiful and deadly. She crossed the space between herself and the sword, with steps so light they barely disturbed the air. Her hand reached out. Her fingers closed around the hilt. The weight surprised her. She'd held swords before. Her late husband had taught her how weapons were balanced. Yet this was different. This was heavier, made for a man's strength, meant for 2 hands in battle. She gripped it with both hands and lifted it from its hook. The blade caught the light and threw it back in sharp lines. She turned toward the sleeping general. The sword felt like it wanted to fall from her grip. Her arms trembled with the effort of holding it steady. Yet her resolve didn't waver. She'd asked God to strengthen her. She'd prayed for the ability to do this impossible thing. Now she would discover if those prayers had been heard. Judith positioned herself at the side of his couch. She studied his neck, exposed and vulnerable. She measured the angle she would need. This had to be swift. This had to be complete. If she failed, if she only wounded him, he would wake. He would kill her. Her people would be lost. She lifted the sword. Her arms shook with the weight. She closed her eyes for just a moment and whispered words so quiet they were more breath than sound. God of my fathers, strengthen me this once. Just this once. Her eyes opened. She looked down at Holofernes one last time. Then she brought the sword down with every bit of strength her body could summon. The blade struck his neck, bit through skin and muscle, jarred against bone. Holofernes' eyes snapped open in shock and agony. His mouth opened to scream, yet only a choked gurgle emerged. His hands moved toward the wound, yet they moved slowly. Too slowly. Drunk reflexes trying to process what sober reflexes might have prevented. Judith didn't hesitate. She pulled the sword free and struck again immediately. This time, the blade cut true and deep, severing what the first blow had begun. The general's head came free from his body in a spray of blood that soaked the cushions and spattered across her robes. His body convulsed. Blood pumped from the severed arteries, spreading across the couch in dark, terrible stains. His eyes stared at nothing. The light in them faded like lamps being extinguished one by one. And then he was still. Judith stood frozen, the bloody sword gripped in her trembling hands. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The act she'd planned and prayed for had become reality. Holofernes, commander of the Assyrian forces, lay dead at her feet. His head lay separate from his body, the face frozen in an expression of shock and pain. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stare at what she'd done. The violence of it, the finality, the shocking amount of blood spreading across expensive cushions and fine carpets. This was not a clean death. This was brutal and messy and utterly real. Her maid appeared at her side. The older woman didn't speak, yet her presence broke through Judith's momentary paralysis. They had no time for shock, no time for processing. They had to move quickly before anyone checked on the general. The maid produced a large cloth from the food bag, the same bag that had carried their provisions all week. Together, they wrapped Holofernes' severed head in the fabric. Blood soaked through immediately, yet the layers held it contained. They placed the wrapped head into the food bag, settling it among the remains of bread and cheese like some terrible harvest. Judith's hands were red with blood. It covered her palms, ran down her wrists, stained the sleeves of her robes. She grabbed another cloth and wiped herself as clean as she could manage. The blood on her clothing would be harder to hide, yet in darkness on dark fabric, perhaps it would pass unnoticed. She looked at the scene they were leaving behind. The headless body sprawled across the blood-soaked couch, the scattered wine cups, the remains of the feast. It looked like a scene from a nightmare, which it was. In the morning, when servants came to wake their general, they would find this horror. Yet morning was hours away, hours they desperately needed. Judith picked up the sword and wiped it as clean as she could, then returned it to its hook on the tent post. Let them puzzle over that detail later. Let them wonder how Holofernes' own weapon had been used against him. She took the food bag from her maid. The weight of it had changed dramatically. What had once contained provisions now held the head of the Assyrian general. The bag seemed to pulse with dark significance, as though everyone who looked at it would immediately know what it contained. Yet there was no choice. They couldn't leave it behind. The head was proof. The head was the trophy that would convince her people of what had happened. The head was the key to everything that came next. Judith moved toward the tent entrance. Her maid followed. They paused at the fabric walls, listening. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of a camp at night. Guards talking quietly, the occasional laugh from soldiers who hadn't yet gone to sleep, the movement of men on patrol. Nothing unusual, nothing alarmed. Judith glanced back one more time at the body on the couch. In the dim lamplight that remained, Holofernes almost looked like he might be sleeping. The blood pooled beneath him was dark enough to blend with shadows. The missing head might not be immediately obvious to a casual glance through the tent flap. They had some time. Not much, yet some. She squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, tried to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She was no longer a woman who had contemplated violence. She was now a woman who had committed it. Blood stained her hands literally and spiritually. There was no going back from this moment. There was only forward, toward whatever consequences awaited. Her maid touched her arm gently, a gesture of support, of shared purpose. They were in this together, bound by the terrible secret they now carried. Judith nodded. She pulled aside the tent flap and stepped out into the night air. The guard, stationed at the entrance, turned toward them. Judith's heart seized in her chest. Would he see the blood? Would he notice something wrong? Would he raise the alarm? Yet the guard only nodded. "Going to pray, lady?" Judith's voice came out steady, though she had no idea how. "As I do every night. The ravine again? Where else would I go?" She even managed a small smile. The guard waved them on. "Watch your step in the dark." They walked past him, past the second guard, into the camp proper, where soldiers slept in their tents or sat around dying fires. Judith and her maid moved with neither haste nor hesitation. Just two women on a familiar errand. Just another night of prayers and ritual washing. Just two women carrying the severed head of the enemy general while his blood dried on their clothing. They passed tent after tent, walked through pools of firelight and stretches of shadow. Judith expected every moment to hear a shout behind them. Every second she waited for discovery, yet none came. The camp remained oblivious to what had happened in their general's tent. They reached the edge of the encampment. The outer sentries stood at their posts, bored and tired. One recognized Judith and called out, "Still keeping your strange hours, Hebrew woman?" "God does not sleep," Judith replied. "Therefore I must be vigilant in prayer." The sentry laughed. "Better you than me. These night watches are cold enough without adding prayers to them." They walked past, beyond the last fires, into the darkness of the valley. The ravine where Judith had prayed every night lay ahead, a deeper shadow against the dark landscape. Yet tonight, they wouldn't stop there. Tonight, they would keep walking. Judith glanced back once. The Assyrian camp spread behind them like a constellation of fires. Thousands of men sleeping peacefully, trusting in their strength, never imagining that their commander lay dead and the two Hebrew women were escaping with the proof. She turned forward again. The lights of Bethulia glimmered in the distance, faint yet unmistakable. Home, safety, the goal they'd left 4 days ago with such uncertain hope. Now they were returning with a victory more complete than anyone had dared imagine. The food bag swung at her side with its terrible weight. Her arms ached from the violence she'd committed. Her soul felt marked by what she'd done. Yet her steps didn't falter. She'd asked God to use her as an instrument. Instruments don't question after the work is done. They simply fulfill their purpose. Beside her, her maid walked in silence. No words were needed. They'd survived the impossible. They'd walked into the enemy camp and emerged victorious. Now, they simply had to reach Bethulia before discovery came. Behind them, Holofernes' body grew cold. His blood soaked into expensive cushions. His head bounced gently in a food bag. With each step, two women took toward freedom, and the night wrapped around them like a cloak, hiding them from pursuing eyes until they could reach the safety of their own people and announce the deliverance that had come through faith and a sharp blade in the darkness. The escape, bearing the trophy. The darkness felt alive. Judith and her maid moved through it like swimmers through deep water, each step taking them farther from the Assyrian camp and closer to the distant lights of Bethulia. The food bag swung at Judith's side, heavier than it had ever been, weighted with its grisly cargo. Neither woman spoke. Speech felt dangerous, as though words might somehow alert the sleeping army behind them. They communicated through glances and small gestures, a language developed over years of serving together. The maid stayed slightly behind Judith, watching their backs, alert for any sound of pursuit. The ravine where Judith had prayed every night appeared as a darker line against the landscape. They reached it and paused. This was the moment of greatest danger. If anyone had discovered Holofernes' body, if guards had grown suspicious, if anyone had decided to follow them, this is where the confrontation would happen. Judith listened. She heard only night sounds, wind moving through grass, the distant call of a night bird, the small rustlings of creatures going about their nocturnal business. No shouts, no running feet, no alarm being raised. They descended into the ravine. The path was familiar now. After 4 nights of walking it, Judith's feet found the way, even in darkness. They reached the small spring where she'd washed herself each evening. The water caught starlight and threw it back in silver pieces. For a moment, Judith considered washing the blood from her hands. The urge to be clean, to remove the physical evidence of what she'd done, rose powerfully. Yet, there was no time. They had to keep moving. Cleanliness would have to wait until they reached safety. They climbed up the far side of the ravine. Now they were in the open valley between the 2 armies. Behind them, the Assyrian camp with its hundreds of fires. Ahead, the walls of Bethulia with its few precious lamps. The distance between felt enormous. Judith set a steady pace, not running, which would exhaust them and might attract attention if anyone happened to be watching. Not walking too slowly, because every moment counted. A purposeful stride that covered ground without obvious desperation. The landscape felt exposed. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential pursuer. Every sound made her heart jump. Yet still they walked. 2 figures moving through darkness, carrying a secret that would change everything. Judith's mind raced ahead to what would come. The guards at Bethulia's gates would see them approaching. Would they recognize her? Would they believe her story? Would they let her in? Or would they think this some kind of Assyrian trick? And once inside, what then? She would have to wake the council. She would have to show them what she carried. She would have to convince them that victory was now possible, that the Assyrian army could be defeated, that God had delivered them through the hands of a widow. The weight of the food bag pulled at her shoulder. Each step reminded her of what it contained, the head of Holofernes, the proof of what she'd accomplished, the key to salvation. Her maid moved beside her without complaint, though she too must be exhausted, must be terrified, must be wondering if they would actually make it to safety, or if soldiers would appear from the darkness and drag them back to face execution. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Each moment felt like an hour, yet also the journey seemed to be passing too quickly, as though they were hurtling toward an uncertain future faster than she could prepare for. The lights of Bethulia grew brighter. She could make out the walls now, dark shapes against the starlit sky. She could see the watchfires burning at intervals along the fortifications. Home, so close now. Yet, this final distance also held danger. Assyrian patrols might be out here, scouts watching the approaches. If they were caught now, so close to safety, everything would be lost. Judith prayed as she walked. Silent prayers, desperate prayers, prayers for protection, for speed, for just a little more time before discovery came. Behind them, the Assyrian camp remained quiet, no alarm bells, no shouts, no sudden flaring of torches that would signal pursuit. The army slept on, trusting in their dead general, unaware that their greatest weapon had been taken from them. How long before someone discovered the body? How long before servants came to wake Holofernes for morning duties? How long before guards grew curious about why the general wasn't stirring? Judith didn't know. She could only walk and pray and hope that God would grant them enough time. The walls of Bethulia loomed larger now. She could see individual stones. She could make out the shapes of guards standing watch. Almost there. Almost safe. Her legs ached. Her shoulders burned from carrying the weight of the bag. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Yet she kept moving, one step, another. Another. The maid stumbled slightly over unseen ground. Judith caught her arm, steadied her. They exchanged a brief look. Exhaustion, determination, shared understanding that they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. The final approach to the gate seemed to take forever. Every step felt like wading through deep water. Yet finally, they stood at the base of the walls. Judith looked up at the guards stationed above. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength for what came next, and called out into the night. The servant matched Judith's rhythm precisely. The two figures moved together like synchronized shadows, making their way across the valley's floor. With every footfall, the food sack bumped rhythmically against Judith's side. She made a conscious effort not to dwell on its contents. She pushed away thoughts of lifeless eyes, gazing into nothingness beneath layers of fabric. Her focus narrowed to nothing but motion, forward progress, the destination ahead. Time stretched on. Minutes accumulated into something longer. They had covered roughly half the valley's distance when a sound pierced through Judith's consciousness, freezing her heart mid-beat. Voices carried from behind them. Distant, yes, but unmistakable. Men shouting to one another in the Assyrian tongue. Her hand shot out, gripping her maid's arm. Both women became statues, their attention sharpened to a razor's edge. The voices drifted from the camp's direction, though their tone carried no urgency or alarm. Judith couldn't distinguish individual words, but the cadence seemed ordinary. Probably guards rotating their watch, she thought, or perhaps soldiers returning from games of chance played late into the night. Not discovery, not yet anyway. They resumed their journey, picking up speed. The voices receded into the distance behind them. Judith's chest heaved harder now, though not from physical effort. Fear drove her ragged breathing. How much time remained before someone entered Holofernes' quarters? How long before they stumbled upon the corpse? How long until the entire encampment exploded into pandemonium and began their pursuit? Bethulia's walls drew nearer. Details emerged from the darkness now. Stone towers stood sentinel. The gate waited. Watchfires flickered along the defensive battlements. Home, so achingly close. Yet that remaining distance felt like the most endless trek of her entire existence. Her legs throbbed with pain. The sack's weight seemed to multiply with each step forward. Dried blood created a sticky, dark coating on her hands. She must resemble something from humanity's darkest nightmares. A woman draped in stained clothing, transporting an unspeakable burden through the darkness. They arrived at the hill's base, where Bethulia perched above. The upward path proved steep and unforgiving. Judith's breathing transformed into gasps as the climb began. Her maid maintained close proximity, prepared to catch her should she falter. The food sack swung erratically, and Judith's grip tightened around it, gripped by terror at the thought of dropping it, of losing the evidence of her accomplishment. Midway up the slope, loose stones shifted beneath her foot. She crashed down onto one knee. Agony lanced through her leg. The maid's hands found her arm immediately, providing stability, helping her rise. Judith forced herself past the pain and continued upward. The walls towered directly above them now. Guard silhouettes stood out against the starlit sky along the battlements, close enough that a shout would carry. But she held her silence. Not yet. Not until absolute safety was assured. They reached the gate's final approach. The enormous wooden doors remained sealed and barricaded, unchanged since the siege's commencement. Judith stumbled forward until she contacted the rough timber, then leaned against it, working to control her breathing. "Identify yourself." A voice descended from above. Cautious, tense. These sentries had spent weeks observing the Assyrian forces. They granted trust to nothing. Judith raised her eyes. She could barely discern the face peering downward. "It is Judith," she called back, "daughter of Merari." Her own voice sounded alien, rough and strained to her ears. Silence followed. Then excited voices overlapped. "It's Judith. She has returned. Open the gates immediately." Wait. Could this be deception? Is it truly her? It's her. I recognize her face clearly. But how is this possible? Why would she return? We believed her dead. The voices multiplied, creating a chorus of confusion. Judith heard the sound of running feet along the walls. Additional guards converged to investigate. Then came the heavy scrape of the bar being lifted from the gate, the groan of ancient hinges as the massive door began swinging inward. Light flooded outward from the opening. After such extended darkness, Judith squinted against the brightness. Figures rushed toward her. Guards, citizens who had been stationed near the gate, people starving for any information whatsoever. They surrounded her immediately, speaking all at once, reaching out as though physical contact would confirm her reality. "Lady Judith, you're alive. How did you manage to escape? Did they harm you in any way? What has happened?" Judith raised her hand, requesting silence. The crowd's noise diminished slightly. She studied the faces encircling her. Exhausted faces, gaunt faces, desperate faces. Her people, the very people for whom she had risked everything. "Send someone to fetch Uzziah," she instructed. "Summon the elders and gather the people together, every single one of them. They need to witness what God has accomplished this night." Someone sprinted away to locate the magistrate. Others began disseminating the word throughout the city. Judith pushed through the gathering crowd, her maid at her side, heading toward the central square. People followed in an ever-growing stream, calling out questions, voicing relief and bewilderment and hope. By the time Judith arrived at the square, hundreds had assembled. More continued arriving with each passing moment, pouring from their homes and descending from the walls. Torches blazed to life. The square filled with illumination and sound and the pressure of countless bodies. Everyone wanted to see. Everyone wanted to comprehend. Uzziah arrived, his robe hastily thrown on. Shabri and Sharmis accompanied him, equally disheveled from being awakened from sleep. They forced their way through the crowd to reach Judith. "My lady," Uzziah spoke, his face displaying profound relief. "We thought we had lost you. We thought the Assyrians had taken you. How did you—" He stopped abruptly, noticing the stains covering her robes. "Is that blood?" Judith nodded. The crowd quieted, sensing that something momentous approached. "I have brought you a gift," Judith announced. Her voice projected across the square, clear and powerful despite her exhaustion. "A sign that God has not abandoned us. Proof that He acts through those who place their trust in Him." She reached into the food sack, her hand closed around cloth, saturated with blood. She extracted the wrapped bundle and began unwrapping it, allowing layers of fabric to fall away. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see. The final cloth came away. Judith raised Holofernes' severed head aloft by its hair. Even in death, the face remained recognizable. Those features every Israelite had learned to dread. Blood dripped from the severed neck, spattering onto the square's stones. The crowd gasped collectively. Someone released a scream. Others shouted in shock and triumph combined. The noise swelled until it consumed the entire city. "Behold the head of Holofernes," Judith proclaimed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Commander of the Assyrian army, he who threatened us with complete destruction. God has delivered him into the hand of a woman." Uzziah stared at the head, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Shabri covered his face with both hands. Sharmis released a sound that was half laughter, half sob. Around them, the crowd erupted into wild celebration. People wept openly. People shouted with joy. People embraced each other. The fear and despair that had hung over the city like a burial shroud began lifting. Hope, impossible hope, flooded back into hearts that had surrendered to despair. Judith stood at the center of it all, still gripping the head of her enemy. Blood dripped steadily onto the stones beneath her. Her arms trembled with fatigue. Her entire body screamed for rest. But she remained upright, allowing her people to see, allowing them to understand that deliverance had arrived in the most unexpected manner imaginable. The widow who had lived in quiet mourning had transformed into a warrior. The woman who had appeared powerless had destroyed the most powerful man in the entire Assyrian Empire. And now she stood before her people, bearing the proof that God uses the weak to shame the strong. The celebration grew louder still. Someone began singing, others joined their voices. The sound rolled through Bethulia like thunder, a song of victory and vindication and profound relief. And on the walls, the guards looked outward toward the Assyrian camp, waiting for the moment when the enemy would discover what a single Hebrew woman had accomplished while they slept. The dawn of deliverance, the head on the wall. The celebration in the square continued throughout the night hours. Judith allowed them their rejoicing for a time, but she understood more needed to be accomplished. The head of Holofernes served as proof for her people, but it needed to become a weapon against the enemy. She raised her hand, requesting quiet, and gradually the crowd settled enough to hear. "Uzziah," she called to the magistrate, "take the head, hang it from our walls where the Assyrians will see it clearly. When morning arrives, they must know that their general is dead. They must understand that their strength has been shattered." Uzziah approached and accepted the gruesome trophy from her hands. He held it carefully, still barely believing what he was witnessing. "It shall be done immediately, and send armed men to the walls," Judith continued. Her tactical mind, so carefully concealed beneath the appearance of simple piety, now showed itself clearly. When the Assyrians discover their general is missing, they will panic. When they see his head displayed on our walls, they will break apart. Send your men out to pursue them as they flee. Strike them while they are in disarray. Charmis stepped forward. "But we have so few fighters. Our men are weakened from thirst and hunger." Judith's eyes blazed with intensity. "The Assyrians do not know that. They only know that their commander has been slain in the very heart of their own camp. They will believe themselves vulnerable to an enemy capable of accomplishing such a thing. Fear will accomplish what an army cannot." The elders exchanged glances. Judith's strategy made brutal sense. An army without its general was like a body without its head, capable of movement perhaps, but not of coordination or purpose. If they struck quickly, while confusion reigned supreme, even Bethulia's small force might rout the mighty Assyrian war machine. Uzziah nodded decisively. "It will be as you say." He turned to the guards. "Bring rope. We hang this where all can see." Men rushed to comply. The crowd parted to create a path as they carried Holofernes' head toward the main gate. Judith followed, with the mass of people streaming behind her. They climbed to the walls, filling the battlements with bodies until barely any room remained to stand. The guards located a prominent spot overlooking the valley, a place where anyone approaching Bethulia would see, a place where the morning sun would illuminate what hung there. They drove a spike into the stone and secured the head by its hair. It swung slightly in the night breeze, a grotesque pendulum marking the end of Assyrian supremacy. Judith stood back and observed it. The face that had smiled at her across a banquet table now stared blankly at nothing. The mouth that had spoken of conquest hung slack and silent. All the pride and power that had animated this man had fled, leaving only meat and bone. She felt no joy in the sight, no satisfaction, only a deep, bone-tired sense of completion. The task was finished, the burden was lifted. Whatever came next, she had done what she came to do. Her maid appeared at her side with a water flask. Judith drank deeply. The water tasted better than any wine. It ran down her throat and seemed to wash away some of the horror of the past hours. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough that she could breathe again. Around her, the citizens of Bethulia stared at the head with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some reached out to touch Judith as she passed, as though contact with her might transfer some of her courage. She accepted their touches with grace, but moved steadily toward a quieter section of the wall. She needed to see the Assyrian camp, needed to watch what would happen when they discovered their loss. The camp below remained peaceful. Fires burned low, guards walked their rounds. Everything appeared normal. But Judith knew that normalcy was about to shatter. Morning would bring revelation, and with revelation would come chaos. The sky began to lighten in the east, not dawn yet, but the promise of it. That grey time before sunrise, when the world seemed suspended between night and day. Judith pulled her blood-stained robe closer around herself and waited. The crowd on the walls grew quiet. Everyone sensed the importance of this moment. They had suffered so much during the siege. Now they would witness the beginning of their deliverance. They watched the camp below with the intensity of people watching a storm approach. Light grew. The stars faded. The sun climbed closer to the horizon. In the Assyrian camp, the morning routines began. Judith could see men emerging from tents, fires being stoked, the changing of the guard, all the normal movements of an army waking to another day. Then she saw a servant approach Holofernes' tent. The man pulled aside the entrance flap and went inside. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the servant stumbled back out, his mouth open in a scream that carried clearly in the morning air. "The general! Someone help the general!" Other servants rushed toward the tent. Officers appeared, running from various directions. The commotion grew rapidly. More screams, shouts of alarm. Men poured out of tents, grabbing weapons, looking around wildly for enemies. An officer emerged from Holofernes' tent, his face white with shock. He began shouting orders. Horns blared. The entire camp erupted into chaos. Soldiers ran in all directions, some toward the command tent, some toward the perimeter, many simply milling in confusion. Someone pointed toward Bethulia's walls. Judith could not hear what was said, but she could see the reaction. Men turned to look up at the city. They saw the head hanging from the battlements. They saw the face of their general staring down at them, in death. The panic intensified. Soldiers who had been gathering into formations broke apart. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. The great Assyrian war machine, so disciplined and powerful, collapsed into terrified disorder. "They're fleeing!" Someone on Bethulia's wall shouted. "Look, they're running!" It was true. All across the camp, soldiers were abandoning their posts. Some grabbed weapons and supplies, others fled with nothing but the clothes they wore. The fear spread like fire through dry grass. Without their commander, without clear orders, with the impossible image of his severed head staring down at them, they broke. Uzziah appeared beside Judith. "It's happening just as you said. They're in complete disarray." "Send out your men now," Judith urged, "before they can regroup. Strike them while fear rules their hearts." Uzziah raised his hand, and trumpets sounded from Bethulia's walls. The gates opened and armed men poured out. Not many. Bethulia's forces were small, but they shouted war cries and charged down the hill with the energy of men who had been given unexpected hope. The Assyrians who were still in the camp saw them coming and fled even faster. Some tried to stand and fight, but they were isolated, cut off from support. The Israelite forces cut through them easily. More importantly, the pursuit drove the fleeing enemy farther and faster, preventing any chance of reorganization. Judith watched it all from the walls, the impossible victory unfolding below, the mighty army that had terrorized nations running in terror from a much smaller force, all because their leader was dead. All because one woman had walked into their midst and accomplished what an army could not. "Send word to the surrounding cities," she told Uzziah. "Tell them what has happened. Their men can join the pursuit. The Assyrians are scattered and vulnerable. This is the moment to drive them from our lands entirely." Uzziah sent runners immediately. Judith knew that as word spread, more forces would join the rout. The Assyrians, who had marched confidently through the region, would find themselves hunted across every valley and hill. Their invasion would end not in glorious conquest, but in humiliating retreat. The sun rose fully now, bathing the valley in golden light. The Assyrian camp stood largely abandoned. Tents flapped in the breeze, fires burned untended, supplies scattered everywhere. The Israelite forces moved through it, claiming weapons and provisions, chasing down any enemy soldiers foolish enough to remain. On the walls of Bethulia, the people erupted into fresh celebration. They embraced each other. They wept with relief. They sang songs of victory. Children who had been crying from thirst now danced with joy. Women who had been preparing to bury their families now praised God for deliverance. Judith stood apart from the celebration, watching. She was exhausted beyond measure. Her body ached. Her hands still bore traces of blood under her fingernails. Her soul felt marked by what she had done. But her people were safe. That was all that mattered. An old woman approached her, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Blessed are you among women," she said, taking Judith's hands in her own. "Blessed are you for saving us." Others heard and took up the cry, "Blessed is Judith, blessed among women." The phrase spread through the crowd, becoming a chant. Judith felt uncomfortable with the adulation. She had not done this for glory. She had done it because no one else could, because God had given her an opportunity and she had taken it. The praise belonged to God, not to her. But she understood that her people needed this. They needed to celebrate. They needed to lift up a human hero they could see and touch. They needed someone to embody their relief and victory. So she accepted their praise with grace, even as she deflected it heavenward in her heart. Uzziah returned with other elders. "My lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have saved not just Bethulia, but all of our people. When word of this spreads, every Assyrian garrison will think twice about remaining. You have broken their spirit." "God broke their spirit," Judith corrected gently. "I was merely the instrument." "Perhaps," Uzziah smiled. "But what an instrument you proved to be." Below, the pursuit continued. Judith could see Israelite forces chasing scattered Assyrians across the valley and into the hills beyond. What had been an organized army was now nothing but fleeing individuals desperate to escape. By nightfall, not a single Assyrian would remain in the region. And in the years to come, commanders planning invasions would remember what happened at Bethulia. They would remember that the mighty Holofernes had been slain by a Hebrew widow. They would think twice before marching against a people whose God could accomplish such things. The head still hung from the wall, turning slowly in the morning breeze. A warning, a trophy, a testament to the truth that battles are not always won by the strong. Sometimes they are won by the faithful. Sometimes deliverance comes through the most unexpected means. Judith finally allowed herself to sit. Her legs simply gave out, and she sank down onto the stone of the battlement. Her maid brought water and food. Judith ate mechanically, barely tasting anything. Her body needed sustenance, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of her prayers in the darkness, her transformation from widow to weapon, the terrible moments in Holofernes' tent, the weight of the head in the food sack, the long walk through the valley with death pursuing and hope ahead. She had survived. Against all odds, she had survived. And more than survived, she had succeeded. The mission that had seemed impossible had been accomplished. Her people were saved. But the cost pressed against her soul. She had taken a life. Not in battle, where such things might be justified more easily, but through deception and planned violence. The morality of it would weigh on her forever. She would pray about it for the rest of her days. She would ask God repeatedly if she had done right or if she had sinned grievously. She suspected she would never receive a clear answer. Some questions exist to be lived with, not resolved. Some burdens must be carried rather than put down. She had chosen this path. Now she would walk it to the end, whatever that meant for her soul. The sun climbed higher. The celebration continued. The pursuit went on. And on the walls of Bethulia, a widow sat quietly, bearing witness to the deliverance she had purchased with blood and guile and desperate faith. The Song of Judith, a hymn of victory. 3 days later, after the scattered Assyrian forces had been completely driven from the region, the people of Bethulia gathered for a formal celebration. Word had spread to every surrounding city. Delegations came from Jerusalem, from the mountain towns, from settlements across the territory. Everyone wanted to witness the aftermath of the miracle. Everyone wanted to honor the woman who had accomplished it. The square overflowed with people. Tents had been erected outside the city walls to house the visitors. Food appeared in abundance. Supplies taken from the abandoned Assyrian camp supplemented the city's own stores. Water flowed freely again, the siege broken. The cisterns no longer rationed. Life had returned to Bethulia. Judith had spent those 3 days in relative seclusion. She had washed herself thoroughly, performing ritual cleansing again and again, as though she could wash away not just the blood but the memory of what her hands had done. She had prayed for hours. She had wept. She had slept the deep sleep of complete exhaustion. Now she emerged to face her people once more. They had asked her to lead them in a song of victory. Such songs were tradition. Miriam had sung after the crossing of the sea. Deborah after the defeat of Sisera. Now they wanted Judith to add her voice to that ancient chorus of women who had witnessed God's deliverance. She wore simple garments, clean and modest. No jewelry, no elaborate robes. She was done with disguises and transformations. She wanted to be simply Judith again, the widow, the faithful, the servant of God, but she understood that she would never be simply anything again. What she had done had marked her forever. The crowd parted as she walked to the platform that had been erected in the square. Uzziah stood there with the other elders. Musicians waited with their instruments. The entire assembly fell silent as Judith climbed the steps. She looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, men and women, children perched on their parents' shoulders, all of them watching her with expressions of awe and gratitude. She felt the weight of their expectations. They wanted her to give voice to their joy, their relief, their gratitude. Judith closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about what had happened. Not just the violence in the tent, but everything that led to it. The faith that had driven her from safety. The prayers that had sustained her. The guidance she had felt even in the darkest moments. She thought about how to express all of that in words. Then she opened her eyes and began to sing. Her voice rose clear and strong, trained by years of prayers and psalms. The musicians joined her, creating a backdrop of sound against which her words could soar. "Strike up the instruments," she sang. "A song to my God with tambourines. Chant to the Lord with cymbals. Sing to him a new song. Exalt and acclaim his name." The crowd swayed with the rhythm. Some began to clap in time. Others raised their hands toward heaven. The song was pulling them together, uniting them in shared emotion. "For the Lord is God," Judith continued. "He crushes warfare. He breaks the enemy into pieces." She sang of the Assyrian invasion, the terror they had inspired, the seemingly unstoppable force that had rolled through the land. Her voice painted pictures of fear and desperation, taking the people back to those dark days when hope had seemed lost. "The enemy boasted he would burn my territory, put my young men to the sword, dash my infants to the ground, seize my children as plunder, take my maidens as spoil." The crowd murmured, remembering the threats, remembering the siege, remembering the thirst and the despair. Then Judith's voice lifted higher, triumphant. "But the Lord Almighty thwarted them by the hand of a female. Their mighty one did not fall by young men. The sons of Titans did not strike him down. No tall giants attacked him. But Judith, daughter of Merari, undid him with the beauty of her face." A cheer rose from the assembly. Judith waited for it to quiet, then continued. She sang of her preparation, of laying aside her widow's garments, of anointing herself with perfume, of adorning herself to captivate him. Each detail became part of the song, transformed from dark strategy into divine comedy. Her sandal ravished his eye, her beauty made his heart captive, the sword cut through his neck. The crowd roared. Musicians played louder. The song became more than just one woman's voice. It became the voice of all the assembled people, their joy and relief finding expression through Judith's words. She sang of the enemy's panic, of their flight and rout, of how the mighty had been brought low and the weak exalted, Her voice carried the age-old truth that God works through unexpected means. That power and might often fall before faith and courage. The lowly have struck them with terror, the weak have pierced them through, they have perished at the might of my Lord. Judith's song continued, verse after verse pouring out. She was not just recounting events but interpreting them, giving them theological meaning. What had happened to Bethulia was more than just a military victory. It was a sign, a reminder that God remains active in the world, that faith matters, that courage is rewarded. The assembly joined her now, singing along with the refrains. Their voices merged into something larger than any individual could produce. It became a collective expression of survival and gratitude. The song transformed from performance into communal worship. Young maidens pierced them through. They perished as children before my Lord's army. Judith sang of praise and thanksgiving. She called on all of creation to worship, mountains and seas, hills and rivers, all nature joining in acclaim of the divine power that had delivered them. Her arms raised toward heaven, her face shone with conviction. Woe to the nations that rise against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in the day of judgment. He will commit their flesh to fire and worms. They shall weep in pain forever. The song reached its climax. The music swelled. The voices of thousands rose together in a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the city. It was more than music. It was catharsis. It was the releasing of all the fear and tension that had built up during the siege. It was the celebration of life when death had seemed certain. Judith let the final note hold, her voice carrying alone for a moment, before the instruments joined in a triumphant resolution. Then silence fell. Complete, profound silence as thousands of people stood caught in the emotional aftermath of the song. Then the cheering began. It started small and grew like a wave crashing over the assembly. People wept openly. They embraced strangers. They shouted praise to God and blessings on Judith. The celebration that had been building for days finally found its full expression. Judith stood on the platform, tears running down her own face. The weight she had been carrying seemed a little lighter now. The song had done what songs do. It had taken the chaos of experience and shaped it into meaning. It had transformed horror into testimony. It had made sense of the senseless. She descended from the platform, but the people would not let her go far. They pressed around her, wanting to touch her, to thank her, to express their gratitude. Old women blessed her. Young mothers held up their children for her to see. Children who would have died if the siege had continued. Men who had expected to be marched off as slaves stood free because of what she had done. A delegation from Jerusalem pushed through the crowd. They were led by the high priest himself, who had traveled to Bethulia specifically to honor Judith. He carried a golden crown and a necklace of precious stones, gifts from the temple treasury. Judith, daughter of Merari, the high priest proclaimed in a voice that carried across the square, "You are the glory of Jerusalem. You are the great pride of our nation. You have done all this with your own hand. You have done great good for the people. May God bless you with eternal blessings. May he make you great forever." He placed the crown on her head and the necklace around her neck. Judith accepted them with grace, but immediately removed them and laid them at the feet of the high priest. "These honors belong to God," she said quietly. "I was merely the vessel through which he chose to work." But the priest would not take them back. "Then keep them as a reminder," he said. "Keep them so that generations to come will know that God honors those who trust him." The celebration continued into the night. Bonfires were lit, food was shared, wine flowed, songs and dancing filled the streets. For 3 full days, Bethulia and its visitors feasted and celebrated. The joy was unrestrained, uncomplicated, pure, but eventually the delegations departed. The extra visitors returned to their homes. The city settled back into something approaching normal life. The siege was over. The enemy was gone. Life could resume. Judith returned to her home. to her routines, to the quiet life she had led before everything changed. She put away the crown and the necklace. She donned her widow's garments once more. She took up her prayers and her studies and her daily rituals. But something had shifted. She could not be the same woman she had been before. The act she had committed, the violence she had done, the lives she had saved, all of it had marked her indelibly. She was still Judith the widow, but she was also Judith the warrior, Judith the deliverer. Judith, who had done the impossible thing. People came to her for advice now, for wisdom, for prayers. She became an unofficial counselor to the city, someone whose judgment was trusted, whose faith was respected. She had proven herself in the most extreme test. Now, people wanted to learn from her. She accepted this new role with the same mixture of reluctance and duty that had characterized her mission to the Assyrian camp. She had not sought prominence, but when it came to her, she used it to serve her people and her God. Years would pass. The story of what happened at Bethulia would spread across nations. Artists would paint her. Poets would write of her. Theologians would debate her. But in Bethulia, she remained simply Judith, a widow who had saved her people, and who now lived quietly, praying and serving, and waiting for the day when she would finally lay down the burden she had taken up. The song she had sung that day in the square was copied and preserved. It became part of the sacred memory of her people. Mothers sang it to their children. Priests recited it in the temple. It endured because it captured a truth that transcended the specific events. That God works through unlikely instruments, that faith empowers courage, that deliverance comes in unexpected forms. And whenever the people sang Judith's song, they remembered. They remembered the siege. They remembered the despair. They remembered one woman's extraordinary act of faith and violence. They remembered that their God was not distant or indifferent, but present and active, working through human hands to accomplish divine purposes. The song lived on, and through it, so did Judith's testimony to a God who saves. The legacy of a warrior echoes through time. The years flowed past like water in a stream. Bethulia rebuilt, crops were planted and harvested, children were born and grew to adulthood. Life continued in its eternal rhythms, but the memory of the siege and the deliverance remained fresh in every heart. Judith lived through those years with quiet dignity. She never remarried, despite numerous offers. Wealthy men from Jerusalem sought her hand. Military leaders wanted to ally themselves with the woman who had defeated Holofernes. Even foreign dignitaries, hearing of her fame, sent proposals. She refused them all. Her heart remained bound to the memory of Manasseh, her first and only husband. More than that, she had found a kind of freedom in widowhood. She belonged to no man, owed obedience to no earthly authority. She was free to serve God and her community without the complications that would come with a new marriage. She grew older gracefully. Her hair turned silver. Lines appeared around her eyes and mouth. Her hands, which had once gripped a sword and severed a general's head, now grew knotted with age, but her mind remained sharp and her faith burned as brightly as ever. People came to her constantly. They sought her wisdom on matters both sacred and practical. Should they plant wheat or barley in the north field? How should they interpret a difficult passage of scripture? What should they do about a boundary dispute with a neighbor? Judith listened to all questions with patience and gave answers drawn from deep wells of experience and study. She used the wealth she had inherited from Manasseh, augmented by gifts from grateful citizens and foreign admirers, to support the poor. Widows and orphans received regular help. The temple received generous donations. When famine struck the region, Judith's resources helped prevent starvation in Bethulia. She also freed her maid, the faithful woman who had accompanied her into the Assyrian camp. Judith gave her property and independence, though the woman chose to remain in Judith's household as a companion rather than a servant. They were bound not by obligation, but by the deep connection forged in those terrible and glorious days. The two women rarely spoke of what had happened in Holofernes' tent. The memory lived between them like a third presence, acknowledged but not dwelt upon. They both understood that some experiences are too intense for casual conversation. The bond they shared needed no words to sustain it. As the years accumulated, Judith became a living legend. Travelers came to Bethulia just to see her. Scribes asked to record her story. Artists wanted to paint her image. She accepted the attention with the same grace she had shown to everything else in her life, neither seeking it nor avoiding it. Stories about her spread across the known world. Some were true, others grew wild in the telling. People claimed she had single-handedly routed entire armies, that she had prophetic visions, that she performed miracles. Judith neither confirmed nor denied these embellishments. She understood that legends serve purposes beyond simple truth-telling. But the core story remained intact. A widow had walked alone into an enemy camp, had seduced and slain their general, and had saved her people from destruction. That much no one could dispute or exaggerate. It was extraordinary enough on its own. The political landscape shifted during Judith's long life. The Assyrian Empire never recovered its former dominance in the region. The humiliation at Bethulia had lasting consequences. Other subject peoples, hearing what had happened, found courage to resist. The empire that had seemed invincible revealed its vulnerability. New powers rose. Old alliances crumbled. The geopolitical map redrew itself again and again. But through all these changes, the small mountain territory that included Bethulia maintained its independence. Partly this was due to strategic factors, but partly it was due to reputation. Who wanted to attack a people whose God had enabled a widow to defeat the great Holofernes? Judith lived to see 3 generations grow up in Bethulia. She blessed babies who became parents who brought their own babies to be blessed. She attended weddings and funerals. She watched the city prosper and struggle and prosper again. She became part of the permanent fabric of the community, as much a feature of Bethulia as its walls or its wells. And as she approached the end of her life, people grew concerned. What would they do without her? Who would provide the wisdom, the stability, the living connection to their greatest moment of deliverance? The thought of Bethulia without Judith seemed almost impossible to imagine. But Judith herself faced her approaching death with calm acceptance. She had lived a long life. She had served her God and her people faithfully. She had no regrets, or at least none that she shared. She made her preparations with the same careful attention she had given to everything else. She distributed her remaining wealth. The poor received generous portions. The temple received sacred vessels. Her household servants received their freedom and enough resources to live comfortably. She left nothing to chance, no loose ends to trouble anyone after she was gone. She also gave specific instructions about her burial. She wanted to be laid beside Manasseh in the family tomb. No elaborate monuments, no special ceremonies, just a simple burial befitting a widow who had lived according to the law. She wanted to be remembered not for monuments, but for actions. The day came when she took to her bed, feeling the final illness settling into her bones. The elders came to visit. Friends gathered outside her home. The whole city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Judith lay in her chamber, the same room where she had prayed before walking into the Assyrian camp all those years ago. Her maid sat beside her, holding her hand. No words passed between them. None were needed. After a lifetime together, they understood each other perfectly. Uzziah, now very old himself, came to her bedside. "My lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is there anything you need? Anything we can do?" Judith smiled faintly. "I need nothing. I have lived well. I have served faithfully. I am ready for whatever comes next." "You have been the salvation of our people," Uzziah said. "Your name will be remembered forever." "Remember God," Judith replied. "I was only the instrument. The hand that held me was divine." She lingered for several days in that twilight between life and death. Sometimes she was conscious and could speak. Other times, she drifted in realms beyond communication. People came to say goodbye, to thank her one last time, to receive a final blessing from the woman who had saved them all. On a quiet morning, as sunlight streamed through her window, Judith slipped away. Her breathing simply stopped. Her maid, still holding her hand, felt her go. The women's eyes met one final time. Then Judith was gone, her spirit released from the body that had served it so well for so many years. The mourning in Bethulia was profound. For 7 days, the entire city grieved. No work was done, no business conducted. Everyone participated in the mourning rituals, honoring the woman who had meant so much to them all. Her funeral drew crowds from across the region. Jerusalem sent representatives. Surrounding towns emptied their populations to attend. They buried her with honor beside Manasseh, just as she had requested. The tomb was simple, but the gathering around it was enormous. After the mourning period, life in Bethulia resumed. But something had changed. The generation that had known Judith personally would eventually pass away. Their children, who had heard the stories firsthand, would also eventually die. But the story itself refused to fade. Scribes recorded her tale in multiple versions. Some focused on the military aspects. Others emphasized the theological dimensions. Still others turned it into a romantic adventure, but all agreed on the essential facts. Judith had saved her people through faith and courage. Artists in distant lands began to depict her. Paintings showed her in various moments of her story. Judith praying in her chamber, Judith confronting the elders, Judith holding the severed head of Holofernes. The images multiplied and spread, each generation reinterpreting her according to their own understanding. Poets wrote verses about her. Some portrayed her as a seductress, emphasizing the beauty she had used as a weapon. Others saw her as a holy warrior, blessed by God. Still others presented her as a symbol of their nation, small, overlooked but deadly when roused to defense. Religious teachers debated her actions. Was it right to use deception? Was it moral to employ seduction as a tactic? Could violence in service of saving lives be justified? These questions had no easy answers, which is partly why they continued to be asked generation after generation. Some saw Judith as proof that God uses women as powerfully as men. Her story stood alongside those of Deborah and Jael as evidence that female courage and leadership were blessed by the divine. Others saw her as an exception, a unique case that proved the rule rather than challenged it. But regardless of interpretation, the story endured. It survived the rise and fall of empires. It persisted through wars and conquests and periods of peace. It adapted to new contexts and new questions. The widow from Bethulia, who had saved her people with a sword and a prayer, became immortal through memory. In synagogues and churches, her story was read and pondered. What did it mean? What did it teach? Different communities found different lessons, but all agreed that the story mattered, that it contained truth worth preserving. In times of oppression, Judith became a symbol of resistance. When powerful enemies threatened, people remembered that the weak could triumph through faith and courage. Her story gave hope to those facing impossible odds, reminded them that deliverance could come from unexpected sources. In times of peace, she became a moral exemplar. Her faithfulness, her devotion, her willingness to risk everything for her people. These qualities were held up as ideals worth emulating. Children were taught about Judith alongside other heroes of faith. The passage of centuries transformed her from a person into an icon. But at the heart of even the most elaborate retellings remained the simple truth. A woman had done an impossible thing because she trusted that God would work through her. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of Judith. Not the military victory, though that was real. Not the political consequences, though those were significant. But the testimony that ordinary people empowered by faith can accomplish extraordinary things. Her story whispers to every generation, courage is possible, deliverance is real, faith matters. The walls may seem insurmountable, the enemy may appear invincible, the situation may feel hopeless, but sometimes, in the darkest hour, one person with enough faith and courage can change everything. Judith's legacy echoes through time, not because she was perfect, she was not. Not because her methods were unquestionable, they were deeply complex. But because she stood at a moment when everything was at stake, and she did not flinch. She acted, she trusted, she risked everything. And because of that, her people survived, her city endured, her story lived on. From that small town of Bethulia, in that brief moment of crisis, ripples spread outward across the centuries. The widow who became a warrior, the faithful who became a hero, the instrument through which the divine worked wonders. This is the legacy of Judith. That faith empowers courage, that courage enables action, and that action, however desperate or unlikely, can bring deliverance. Her story belongs not just to one people or one time, but to all who face impossible odds and dare to believe that even one person, armed with nothing but trust in God, can change the course of history. The warrior woman who saved her people sleeps in her tomb beside her husband. But her story walks through the world, living and active, speaking to each new generation, teaching, inspiring, challenging, reminding us all that deliverance comes in unexpected forms and that the hand of God works through those willing to be used. This is the entire story of Judith. From the siege that nearly destroyed her people to the act of violence that saved them. From the widow's chamber to the enemy's tent, from despair to deliverance. From one woman's prayer to a legacy that spans the ages. Her story is complete, but its meaning remains open, waiting for each reader, each listener, each generation to discover what truth speaks to them from the life of the widow who became a warrior and saved her people from destruction.